He called me on an open line out of the blue, and I could barely believe who he was. His name was Nat Kobitz. He was the US Navy's former longtime Director of Science and Technology Development, their chief R&D scientist, their chief geek for many years, for over 30 years. He was a beautiful guy, and it was an act of courage on his part. And I remember one of the conversations I had with him was, do you think there's any good reason? Because this is the thing I wrestle with, I know you do as well. What's the dirty secret?
Right.
Why? Why can't we know this? You know, if the US has recovered technology, why can't we know? And he hadn't been told that. And he had that rigid doctrinaire thing about how he wasn't read into that part of it. And that was a compartmentalized issue he wasn't entitled to know about. What he told me was that he'd been told that the United States had recovered multiple craft.
Wow.
Multiple craft. And he implied very strongly that Roswell and another case I'm interested in, Aztec and Kingman, were all real incidents.
It didn't start or end with Roswell. On this channel, we have covered myriad UFO crash retrieval cases ranging from brief overviews to exhaustive full investigations. These cases differ greatly, some featuring a wealth of witnesses, paper trails, or threads of investigation, such as 1933 Magenta, Italy, 1965 Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, and 1953 Kingman, Arizona, while other cases are plagued by a lack of witnesses, controversy, or incomplete investigation, such as 2008 Needles, California, 1950 El Indio, Texas, or 1974 Coyame, Mexico. There is one UFO crash retrieval case that seems to exist somewhere in the middle, a case that is often overshadowed by the most infamous UFO crash retrieval case of all time, 1947's Roswell, that occurred just 8 months after in northern New Mexico. This case is marred by controversy, yet bolstered by tremendous investigation and witness testimony, a case that has been debunked, labeled as a hoax several times over, but yet still refuses to die. The 25 March 1948 Aztec, New Mexico UFO crash retrieval. This incident, to me, offers unbridled insights into the complexity of UFO crash retrieval, while the story of the saucer and biologics retrieval has remained consistent across the decades from several unconnected first- and second-hand witnesses and informants. The accusations and reprisals levied against those who have dared to discuss Aztec are indeed astounding. I'm sure many watching this video are already apprehensive to hear the word Aztec. After all, the Aztec crash is not without its problems. The initial sources of the story, Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer, are after all convicted con men, so this means the case is a simple hoax, as Wikipedia and several UFO researchers like to point out, right? Or is the reputation of these men and the quality of the endless debunks against Aztec just as complex as the rest of the story itself? Why in the world would I cover a case that so many have written off as a hoaxed event perpetuated to sell oil-finding devices? Taking a step back and analyzing almost 80 years of research on this case reveals to me, just as William Steinman titled his 1986 book, that Aztec is indeed a well-kept secret. From similarities with the Aztec crash transport and the words of former Director of Naval Intelligence Sumner Shapiro in conversation with NASA mission specialist Bob Eschler, to the possible involvement of some of the United States' most legendary scientists, including Vannevar Bush, John von Neumann, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, to bizarre late 40s and early 50s efforts by U.S. agencies such as AFOSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigation, and FBI's attempts to intercept photos of the crashed disk. Every single avenue of the Aztec case is rich with the call for investigation. The Aztec crash may just give us access to travel back in time and analyze the fledgling years of UFO legacy program operations, not only to study how the United States' top minds were employed to study recovered technologies of unknown origin, but also to gauge the severity with which UFO retrieval teams would attempt to rectify the public folly that was the July 1947 Roswell, New Mexico crash. So travel back in time with me to the early morning of 25 March 1948 onto a rocky mesa just 12 miles northeast of Aztec, New Mexico. And let's investigate the case of an enormous crashed disk of non-human origin taken into the custody of U.S. military and scientists and the ensuing sophisticated campaign of organized disinformation. Hey guys, it's UAP Gerb, and I am thrilled for you to join me today as we discuss a case that, in my opinion, requires a Herculean amount of analysis and investigation. The 1948 Aztec, New Mexico UFO Crash Retrieval. This investigation serves to comprehensively analyze the story of Aztec, the witnesses, sources, and reporters involved, the attempts to prove the case a hoax, as well as the possible structure of early UFO crash retrieval organizations and the possible involvement of the ever-elusive Majestic 12. So did a 99.9-foot diameter disk manned by 14 to 16 humanoids really crash just south of Durango, Colorado in 1948? Did Bush, Oppenheimer, von Neumann, and other esteemed scientists personally investigate the retrieved disk? Did the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit really disassemble and take the craft to Los Alamos National Labs? Or is this case, just as Wikipedia would have you believe, just a simple hoax by the con men Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer? Well, join me today as we try and find out. And before we get started, as I just mentioned, the structure of the Aztec case is labyrinthine, possibly purposely so, and due to the complexity of this case, we will primarily reference 6 key sources, 3 of which are sublime books written about the crash saucer. The legendary 1950s Behind the Flying Saucers by Frank Scully, which introduced the world to Aztec. 1986's Hidden Gem, UFO Crash at Aztec, a well-kept secret by one of my favorite UFO researchers, William Steinman, which resurrected the case while naming possible officials and scientists behind the retrieval. 2015's The Aztec UFO Incident, the case, evidence, and elaborate cover-up of one of the most perplexing crashes in history by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, which carefully and excellently evaluates the witnesses and sources of Aztec, addresses skeptics and debunkers, and carefully evaluates the case as a whole. The last, which is technically a collection of works, is the legendary UFO researcher Leonard Stringfield and his magnum opus UFO Crash Retrieval Status Reports 1 through 7, which introduces a plethora of new witnesses, sources, and information to the case. You may have noticed here, I only listed 4 of 6 sources. Well, this is because we will also address, study, and evaluate the 2 major debunks to the New Mexico flying saucer retrieval. 1952's Flying Saucers and the Mysterious Little Men, written by the jealous J.P. Cahn, which sought to destroy the Aztec case, author Frank Scully, and Scully's sources Silas Newton, and the amalgamation of 9 scientists called Dr. G, Cahn falsely labeled as one singular man, Leo Gebauer. As well as 1975's The Flying Saucer Crash of 1948 is a Hoax by Mike McKellen, which released just 1 year after sources of Leonard Stringfield breathed new life into the case. Now, real fast last thing. Many who watch this channel know Steinman's book is one of the most elusive and coveted UFO crash retrieval books of all time. After all, only 1,000 copies were ever printed. But guys, I am thrilled to say for this project, I have purchased this title for myself so we can enjoy high-quality scans of pages and images. And with all that out of the way, let us finally dive in. Following the Second World War and sitting at the dawn of the Cold War, the southern U.S. state of New Mexico was ripe with atomic energy and weapons development. The state employed numerous high-powered radar installations to defend crown jewel weapons testing and RDT&E facilities such as Los Alamos National Labs, White Sands Missile Range, and Sandia National Labs from Soviet bomber attacks. By 1948, the year of our incident, the elder UFO legacy program gatekeeping structure, the Atomic Energy Commission, was engaged in one Project Twinkle, a program that analyzed UFOs, including green fireballs at Los Alamos, Sandia, and Holloman Air Force Base. Therefore, I'd say it's safe for us to assume the Atomic Energy Commission and the newly formed United States Air Force radars detected an object of unknown origin near Aztec, New Mexico, roughly 160 miles from Los Alamos. Indeed, sources of William Steinman would appear on record in 1986, claiming the craft was identified by 3 separate Southwest radar installations. Viewers of my channel will likely recall mention of Los Alamos and Sandia in almost every single project I do as engaging in UFO legacy program operations from craft and material housing to TUO or technologies of unknown origin exploitation, and we will expand on this much more later on. Numerous eyewitnesses described seeing a low-flying saucer-shaped object wobbling as if it were in peril, colliding or nearly colliding with nearby mesas until it was seen crashing in nearby Hart Canyon. The subject of local eyewitnesses to Aztec is of tremendous importance to our investigation, and we will discuss virtually all publicly named Aztec witnesses later on in our investigation. Citizens, ranchers, 2 policemen, and nearby oil field workers quickly arrived to the crash scene. To this day, it is still unknown what caused this crash after Roswell. Several researchers believe somehow high-powered radar interfered with the craft's propulsion systems. These sentiments were shared by Colonel Philip J. Corso of the U.S. Army Foreign Technology Division, who theorized the Roswell crash just 8 months prior had crashed due to radar interference. This becomes all the more interesting as we describe this crash retrieval. All eyewitness accounts describe the craft as fully undamaged, but perhaps there is credence to the theory the craft was downed via high-powered radar. During their boots-on-the-ground crusade to validate or falsify the Aztec crash, Scott and Suzanne Ramsey met with one Lee Crane. Crane worked in the Aztec area during 1950. Crane discussed how USAF personnel from the El Vado 767 AC&W radar site, originally the Los Alamos radar installation to protect Los Alamos, and one of the sites likely involved with the tracking of non-human saucers, would frequent the same diner as Crane. These Air Force personnel would bring in freshly killed, half-cooked ducks that they stated had been knocked out of the air by powerful microwave radar being used at the facility. Now, viewers of my channel will absolutely recall, as recently as my project on SAIC, that I frequently discuss how Ronald Reagan's 1983 Strategic Defense Initiative, built to protect the United States from Soviet ICBMs, secretly engaged in highly compartmentalized, deep-sixed UFO program operations, some of which harnessed SDI's lethality and target hardening or particle beam weapons programs to offensively target UFOs with microwave or X-ray weaponry. In this project, I discussed how SAIC would have likely been the prime contractor aiding the SDI in shooting down non-human craft, and quite the interesting connection here. Possibly, these weapons against UFOs were accidentally discovered during the late 1940s. But now, let's get back to late March 1948, on top of the Hart Canyon Mesa. Consistent across eyewitness statements, ranging from the sources of Scully, Newton, and the Ramseys, are reports of an enormous craft measuring 99.9 feet, resting virtually undamaged atop the mesa at an angle. Though crashed, could this saucer have landed on its own guidance? The saucer appeared of a light metal composition, absent from any rivets, bolts, screws, signs of welding, landing gear, or propulsion systems. In the middle of the bizarre craft sat what appeared to be a crew cabin, an almost sphere measuring 18 feet in diameter and 6 feet in height. Locals from Aztec and oilfield workers began to climb aboard the craft, remarking how light the material was. And quickly on scene, witnesses described a helicopter flying overhead. The sight was almost surreal to eyewitnesses such as Doug Noland, as the likely Sikorsky H-5 series or Bell H-13 was quite new technology. Rapidly, men in uniform, unknown if Army or Air Force, as the two were recently separated, pulled to the scene in jeeps that were befitting of the U.S. Army. Multiple witness testimonies surrounding Aztec state the recovery effort was conducted out of the USAF Walker Base in New Mexico. Allegedly, personnel were flown to Durango, Colorado, where a short drive was completed to the crash site. This will be explored further later by witnesses, such as USAF airmen known as pseudonym George. And Walker Air Force Base was the new name for Roswell Army Airfield. The on-site military immediately separated citizens at the crash site, informing them never to speak about the incident and informing the locals on scene the object was extremely important to U.S. national security. Now, Frank Scully's early 50s recount of Aztec, as informed by Silas Newton, states investigators on site were able to gain access to the craft via punctured porthole. As investigators approached the seemingly glass-like windows, they observed these portholes were not glass, but indeed semi-translucent. Inside the craft, 2 humanoid bodies were observed slumped over an instrument panel that appeared to be but 4 feet high, charred, and possibly mangled. According to Scully, investigators jammed a wood or metal rod into the mysteriously punctured porthole, poking and prodding at the instrument panel until a panel opened up, giving access to the craft. Inside the vehicle appeared to be a separate crew cabin where 12 to 14 separate bodies lay dead on the ground. While the story of the crash, the retrieval process, and the method of gaining entry to the craft are near identical, Steinman's account introduces far more specifics, such as named on-site scientific retrieval personnel. Steinman writes the 30 to 40-year-old seasoned military members on scene were members of the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, a long-forgotten U.S. Army division shown to Steinman by the Freedom of Information Act to exist solely through institutional memory. IPU has its own controversy and juicy alleged report in the Majestic 12 leaks, which we will address in a section specifically on IPU. According to Steinman's sources, the impact area of the craft was relayed to Air Defense Commander General George C. Marshall, who then contacted the IPU and head of the Majestic 12, the illustrious head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, Dr. Vannevar Bush. Steinman first learned of the existence of IPU in the early 1980s, so it is intriguing by 1986. He had learned the IPU allegedly operated out of Camp Hale, Colorado, and served the function to collect and deliver disabled or crashed discs to certain specific secret locations. Now, Vannevar Bush in the MJ-12. Bush is named ad nauseum in the Majestic documents, most famously the Eisenhower briefing document as MJ-1, the head of the secret organization created under President Harry Truman to act as the original UFO legacy program. But Bush's ties to UFOs are not solely relegated to the Majestic documents. Later in this project, we will discuss physicist and prodigy of Einstein, Robert A. SARBACHER, who claimed in 1950 UFO programs were classified higher than the H-bomb and operated under Vannevar Bush. Keep an eye out for this section later on. Accompanying Bush and the IPU was a team of 8 other scientists we will touch on when we cover in greater detail Steinman's work. But these included Dr. Robert J. Oppenheimer, Dr. John von Neumann, and Dr. Detlev Bronk. 4 of these men have been labeled as original Majestic 12 members. On site, according to Steinman's work, the team accessed the craft via punctured porthole. Inside the cabin sat 2 humanoid figures, with 12 more bodies littered across the chamber. With Aztec, we do see varying reports of 12 to 16 bodies. Instrument panels around the craft wall showed high-tech screens sprawled with glyphic-style writing. From Randy Anderson to Mark's 1991 deep-sea recovery to 1965 Kecksburg, glyphic iconography is inseparable from non-human technology. A quote-unquote book was found inside the craft, or better described as a pamphlet of plastic displaying the same glyphic-style writing. General Marshall allegedly passed this on to 2 leading cryptologists, William F. Friedman and Lambro C. Kalihamos, who were unsuccessful in their attempts to decipher the codes. Physiologist and biophysicist Dr. Detlev Bronk ordered the bodies to be placed on dry ice. According to Steinman's sources, Air Research Corporation supplied freezing equipment. As director of R&D of the corporation, Dr. Paul A. Scherer was both a colleague of Vannevar Bush and a cryogenics specialist. As a quick detour, I do find it rather fascinating in 1954, under the administration of the recent presidential incumbent Dwight D. Eisenhower, Dr. Paul A. Scherer was one of 12 scientists named onto the board of directors of a group called the American Association for the Advancement of Science that sought radical changes in the scientific community. This panel of esteemed scientists sought to harness global scientific advancements for humanity's progress instead of preserving, quote, the secrecy of scientific knowledge we already have, end quote. Seen as Dwight D. Eisenhower is often cited as the president who lost control of UFO legacy programs, who ran an administration in which non-human crash retrieval and material exploitation programs broke free from traditional oversight channels and gained unprecedented autonomy. How fascinating is it that Dr. Paul A. Scherrer, a scientist alleged to have participated in non-human biologics retrieval in 1948, desperately sought to see the end of scientific secrecy under the guise of national security following the Truman administration? Dr. Bronk would allegedly go on to detail full autopsies for the pilots, which were published in the legendary, ever-elusive, and deep-sixed Project Blue Book/Sign Report No. 13. These bodies feature disproportionately large heads, slant eyes, small noses, and mouths. The creatures weighed solely 40 pounds on average, with small torsos and thin necks. The fingers of the creatures were webbed, and internal systems revealed no digestive systems or gastrointestinal tracts, no alimentary or intestinal canal, and no reproductive organs. Instead of blood, the circulatory system of the creatures was comprised of a colorless liquid with no red cells that smelled like ozone. These creature descriptions sound near identical to that of the EBE-1 detailed in the controversial yet provocative 1950s Majestic 12 Special Operations Manual 1 I have covered in detail with Ryan Wood. Now, I must mention here is where there are slight variances between Scully's and Steinman's description of the biologics. Scully described the beings as almost perfectly humanoid, just scaled differently with perfect teeth. The retrieval process of the crashed disc at Aztec took up to 2 weeks. Helicopters certainly were unable to provide the necessary carrying capacity to retrieve the 99.9-foot disc. So how in the world was it extracted? These points here, to me, offer some of the most fascinating insights into Aztec, some non-human craft, and incredible testimonies heard decades after the Aztec event. The craft was dismantled. The science team figured out the large ring of metal rotated around the centralized, stabilized cabin. Indeed, the scientists were able to dismantle the craft. The vehicle was manufactured in segments, which fitted into grooves and were pinned together around the base. The vehicle was divided into the crew cabin in 3 equal-sized pieces of the disc. Now, stop me if you've heard this before.
Well, I had contacted Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, who was the head of the National Security Agency in the United States, Deputy Director at CIA, Director of Naval Intelligence, and a variety of intelligence posts, a technologist, and clearly someone that if this was really accurate, that there really were UFOs and non-human intelligence around, this is a man who had to know. Mm-hmm. So I was able to contact him thanks to a contact through Admiral Lord Hill Norton here in the UK. And this conversation, he alarmingly not only indicated that these issues were covered under national secrecy laws, but that the United States government did in fact have possession of the hardware associated with this. In other words, this was an actual physical phenomenon.
A craft, a spaceship.
Several of them, and they were in operational condition.
Bobby Ray Inman, one of, if not the most critical figure to this channel, served as director of the National Underwater Reconnaissance Office, a 4-star Navy admiral, director of Naval Intelligence, deputy director of Central Intelligence, director of the NSA, and board member of SAIC, Wackenhut, and possibly DSAI. And Inman seems to connect to every project I do these days. I have multiple videos where Inman is discussed at length, so I highly recommend checking out any of these projects. Famously, in a 1989 recorded phone call with NASA mission specialist Bob Eschler, Inman volunteered CIA Directorate of Science and Technology Deputy Director and NRO Program B Director R. Everett Hindman as the person to ask about recovered UFOs becoming available for technological research. Inman would additionally connect Bob Eschler with another former director of naval intelligence, Sumner Shapiro. In 1989, Eschler met Shapiro under the pretense he was interested in working with the quote-unquote group that managed UFO information. At this time, Shapiro was retired as DNI and served as an executive with BDM International. BDM, of course, is another former defense contractor purchased by Northrop Grumman I have directly accused of being involved with the UFO Legacy Program operations. Shapiro informed Eschler factions within the U.S. possessed extraterrestrial vehicles that he, Shapiro, had even studied at close quarters. According to the former DNI, teams would take the craft apart, pack them up, and ship them around the country to different laboratories. The craft featured unique, interlocking components that had to be disassembled in an exact sequence to be put back together. Was Shapiro talking about the Aztec case? After all, in how many UFO crash retrieval cases do we hear of a craft being dismantled in a complex and direct method? Let's also focus on this rotatable crew compartment. USAF Master Sergeant Edgar Fouché claimed the TR-3B alien reproduction vehicle, whose propulsion systems were reverse engineered by Lawrence Livermore Labs and Sandia National Labs from non-human propulsion systems, featured a rotatable crew compartment within the triangle.
The circular plasma field accelerator ring, called the magnetic field disruptor, surrounds a rotatable crew compartment. It's far ahead of anything you've ever imagined as far as technology. Sandia and Livermore Laboratories developed a reverse-engineered MFD, and I believe the government will go at any lengths to protect this technology. But you're not going to be able to build one of these from what I tell you.
Anyways, after careful dismantling of the craft, multiple concrete pads, still available to this day, were constructed to assist 3 M25 Dragon Wagon tank transports, which were stored in New Mexico bases post-World War II. Indeed, the Ramseys were able to find Bureau of Reclamation records from 1948 discussing heavy earth-moving equipment, cranes, and lowboys being used to move concrete and steel structures in Aztec for the Mancos project. Mention of the Bureau of Reclamation possibly supplying equipment for moving of the Aztec craft gives us means to pause and reflect. Seen as in works prior, I have discussed tunneling contracts for tunnel boring machines under the Bureau of Reclamation, secretly engaging in clandestine operations to aid in the construction of deep underground military bases and their alleged connective tunnel systems. The convoy, carrying enormous pieces of a disc, avoided roads to Aztec and drove the wreckage to Los Alamos National Labs. The bodies were transported away, likely to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the craft remained at Los Alamos for over a year before being transported again. The craft being shipped around serves as another nod to Shapiro, no? And quickly, just in case you are unfamiliar with my other work, mention of Los Alamos as the first destination for the craft is of massive consequence. I've previously discussed extensive ties with Los Alamos National Labs, a Department of Energy federally funded research and development center, and deep underground military bases, UFO Legacy Program gatekeepers, possible material exploitation programs, etc. But relevant to today's discussion, let's look back to 1994 to the words of former New Mexico State Representative J. Andrew Kistner. Kistner stated sources within White Sands Proving Ground and the Naval Research Lab informed him that 2 to 4 flying discs were recovered during 1947 and 1948. And the discs were possessed and analyzed by both Los Alamos National Labs and Sandia National Labs 7th Division under control of the Atomic Energy Commission. Kistner's sources claimed that institutions such as MIT, Brookhaven National Labs, the RAND Corporation, and Joint Research and Development Board, created partly and chaired by Dr. Vannevar Bush, played a quote-unquote major role following the 1947 crashes. Additionally prudent to Aztec, Kistner mentioned Project Supremacy, a possible UFO-related program created in 1947 that operated specifically to track and perform data acquisition on triangulated New Mexico radar sites. The New Mexico state rep would even state his sources claimed presidential executive orders signed in 1948 allowed the Atomic Energy Commission full custody of the recovered discs, with the National Security Council serving as program coordinator with support from the Air Force Systems Command, the Naval Research Laboratory, and Dr. Bush's Research and Development Board. One might recall here how Dr. Eric Davis spoke of PEDS, or Presidential Emergency Action Documents, signed in the 50s by President Eisenhower to structure UFO legacy program operations outside of congressional oversight. In fact, post-Roswell, early July 1947, leading up to the morning of 25 March 1948, we may have even more actionable intelligence that signifies elements of the United States government and military were actively engaging in establishing programs to deal with recovered non-human craft. On 29 January 1947, Secretary of War Robert P. Patterson and Secretary of the Navy, original accused MJ-12 member and likely murder victim James V. Forrestal, established AFSWP, the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project. This AFSWP was tasked to manage nuclear weapons jointly staffed by U.S. Army and Navy. At this time, the AFSWP operated within Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs. As we know from the 2023 and 2024 UAPDA legislation, UFO data, materials, etc. have historically been misclassified as transclassified foreign nuclear information under the 1954 Atomic Energy Agreement. This thread is indeed intriguing that possibly the AFSWP out of Los Alamos and Sandia handled the wreckage of both the Roswell and Aztec crashes and served as the foundation out of which the Atomic Energy Commission established a 1954 agreement to obfuscate and hide UFO data. But now that we have covered the basis of the Aztec crash, let's really start to dive in. The Aztec crash made its way into the public zeitgeist with Frank Scully's 1950 best-selling book, Behind the Flying Saucers. Though Scully had previously written about this incident in 1949 in 2 Variety magazine columns. Behind the Flying Saucers served as the second real book on flying saucers after Donald Kehoe's Flying Saucers Are Real. Scully's book truly served as the impetus for conversations between physicist and consultant to Vannevar Bush's Research and Development Board, Robert SARBACHER, and Canadian radio engineer Wilbert B. Smith that would ultimately lead to Canada's first 2 official programs on UFOs, Project Magnet and Second Story. We will expand on this much later in the investigation, and I also have an entire video on SARBACHER. But Wilbert B. Smith asking SARBACHER about Frank Scully's bestseller and how much of it was ultimately true led to one of the most fascinating memos of all time. SARBACHER informed Smith that not only the contents of Behind the Flying Saucers were fundamentally correct, but also that flying saucers exist. The subject of UFOs is classified in the United States even higher than the H-bomb, and efforts to capture and study UFOs were spearheaded by Vannevar Bush. Scully's book reported the Aztec incident as we discussed prior. Besides the data from Steinman, which we identified, Scully also reported that up to 1950, there had been 4 such recoveries. Within the book, Scully suggested, based on his plentiful sources, UFOs operated on magnetic principles. And that finally brings us to Scully's sources, the linchpin of this entire video. Scully's source of the Aztec crash was one Mr. Silas M. Newton, a complicated, questionable, and intriguing character who requires ample time to investigate, as well as Mr. G, an amalgamation of up to 8 scientists. Newton claimed no first-hand experience with the crash retrieval, bar handling equipment retrieved, souvenirs claimed, and pieces taken from the crash. Newton's information came to him from his close, first-hand confidants, the enigmatic Mr. G. Indeed, a 1952 debunk on Aztec attempted to label Mr. G as just one man, the equally complicated Leo Gebauer, but this is simply not the case. Using the work of Suzanne and Scott Ramsey, as well as William Steinman, we will actually attempt to name as many of the Mr. Gs as possible later in this investigation. After all, throughout the book, Scully would describe the collection of Gs as having, quote, more degrees than a thermometer, end quote. Scully and Newton would take these names with them to the grave. Scully first heard of the Aztec event from Silas Newton, owner of the Newton Oil Company with a truly checkered past. The two had a relationship for multiple years, and early on, when discussing flying saucers, Newton invited Scully to the Mojave Desert to test an oil-finding device called a doodlebug. that Newton would later on face charges for, a fraudulent device that may just have more basis in reality than hoax arguments would admit. Newton would introduce Scully to Dr. G, and Dr. G would tell Scully much of what we had covered today, the recovery being intact, Los Alamos retrieving the vehicle, the craft operated by magnetism, and that some sort of plastic pamphlet was found in the craft with symbols that were not successfully deciphered. Dr. G infamously showed Scully a cube-like device that emitted sounds like a radio and small gear-like objects and discs that they claimed originated from the Aztec craft, implying these men were actually at the crash site. The men would even show Scully images of the craft, and keep this in mind as these images will become important throughout the video. Even Scully's widow claimed she had personally seen these photographs. But Scully wasn't the first person to whom Silas Newton would disclose information on Aztec. No, after receiving information about the crash from the enigmatic pool of Mr. G, likely scientists with whom Newton had previously worked alongside in the oil industry and before the publishing of Behind the Flying Saucers, Newton had lectured on the crash event at the University of Denver on 8 March 1950 under the pseudonym Scientist X. At this lecture, Newton took the place of the original speaker, possibly a Mr. G, and discussed the flying saucer crash in an effort to interest the students in UFOs. Thankfully, radio salesman and engineer George Kohler from Denver KMYR, who was friends with Newton and possibly some of the Mr. Gs, helped set up this event. Kohler investigated the lecture, and thanks to the Ramseys' keen research skills, both the recording as well as items from Newton's drawings on the chalkboard were found in Scully's archive. In this 1950 lecture, Newton discussed a crash of a flying saucer that occurred 2 years prior in a 500-mile radius to Denver, drew details of the craft seen on screen now, and discussed complex magnetism as the craft's propulsive force. Clearly, this lecture did not go unnoticed, as the day after the lecture, months before the release of Scully's bestseller, Air Force Office of Special Investigation visited KMYR Denver looking for Kohler. After 2 days of trying, Kohler was interrogated by Special Agent Hansen and Unger about Newton, flying saucers, possible cube-like radios retrieved from the crash, and more. Thanks to the Ramseys again for finding and reproducing this interrogation. In a bizarre twist of events, following Newton's lecture on the saucer and the release of Behind the Flying Saucers in September of 1950, multiple other U.S. agencies were tracking leads and leaks on the Aztec crash. On 30 September 1950, the Army CID, or Criminal Investigation Division, reported that a sting operation was staged at the Edelweiss Bar and Melwin Hotel in Denver. FBI and CID were trying to intercept the sale of photographs of the Aztec saucer from one L.D. McLaughlin to Mr. Klein from the Baltimore Sun. The Ramseys filed Freedom of Information Act requests for more documents than the scant few we possess, but were informed that all were destroyed. And in another fork in the road, there was no Mr. Klein that worked for the Baltimore Sun at this time. So 6 months after Newton discussed the Aztec crash at the University of Denver, the FBI and CID attempted to intercept photos of the crash, and remember, Scully's widow claimed to see such photos. Shortly after the release of Behind the Flying Saucers, the case was at large labeled a hoax due to a September 1952 publication by San Francisco Chronicle writer J.P. Cahn. Cahn effectively killed the story by making the retrieval appear phony, discrediting Scully, and his most damaging act, discrediting Scully's sources, Newton and Dr. G. After all, around the time of J.P. Cahn's article, Newton and one Dr. G, Leo Gebauer, who Cahn labeled as the singular man behind Dr. G, were charged with defrauding Denver businessman Herman Flater around the use of an oil-finding device we discussed called the Doodlebug. This damning publication and context around Cahn, Newton, and Gebauer's charges are well worth our time and analysis, as there is far more here than meets the eye, including questioning the sourcing, methods, and honesty of the hero of the hoax, J.P. Cahn. To quote the Ramseys, for decades, the 1948 Aztec crash has looked like this, quote,
Frank Scully's story was going along great until a top-shelf journalist by the name of J.P. Cahn broke the big story of a bunch of con men who had robbed poor investors out of their life savings in a worthless oil scheme so that they were destitute and standing in bread lines. Thank God for J.P. Cahn. He saved the day by exposing these con men who were taking in money and never paying a dime back. These horrible con men were arrested and sent off to jail, and the Aztec story was nothing more than a fiction concocted by a bunch of bad and nasty crooks, end quote.
While Newton is far from the only source and witness of Aztec, the story has largely been marred and labeled a hoax due to Cahn's damning piece on Newton. Predating Behind the Flying Saucers, Scully and Cahn actually shared history. In 1949, Cahn approached Scully when he got wind of the saucer story in Variety magazine. Cahn wished to capitalize off of the craze that was flying saucers. Cahn attempted to purchase the flying saucer story for the San Francisco Chronicle from Scully in a disgraceful lowball. The two failed to agree to terms, with Scully defiantly resting on his laurels of the validity of the story over any amount of money. Strangely, Cahn returned to the Chronicle claiming to his superiors that he and Scully had actually agreed to terms. During these failed business dealings, Scully had introduced Cahn to Newton at Scully's home. Cahn became almost obsessed with Newton and the Aztec story, following Newton to San Francisco to get a 1.5-hour meeting with the oil man. Newton would write regarding a dinner with Cahn, quote, "The talk was saucers. The theme of their talk was that I owed something to the world and I should let the Chronicle guide me," end quote. And, quote, "The meeting lasted 1.5 hours. They wanted their great conservative paper to get to the bottom, document the whole thing, and if they thought it was true, then give it to the world," end quote. Ironically, Newton also said, quote, "They would satisfy anyone that they would protect the identity of all concerned," end quote. Cahn would fully turn his story pitch away from Scully towards Newton, wishing for Newton to assemble the entire roster of Dr. G for $25,000 in 1952 money and 50% royalties in any publication. Cahn would famously state in his debunk that during these meetings with Newton, Silas showed him quote-unquote gears from the crash site, but dubiously, Cahn would steal one of these pieces, have it tested, and determine the relic was simply common aluminum. Now, as it turns out, these pieces from a saucer given to Newton were indeed copies, and while Newton and Scully had more than likely seen the real collection of items from Dr. G, the items in Newton's possessions were little more than replicas. This approach by Newton does make logical sense here. Recall in 1950, AFOSI interrogating radio salesman Kohler about parts from a flying saucer the day after Newton's University of Denver lecture, and additionally recall how the FBI and Army CID were actively hunting Aztec photos. J.P. Cahn would, as a nail in the coffin to Aztec, label one Mr. Leo Gebauer as the sole Dr. G and implicate the two men in oil fraud. So before we move on to this criminal case that effectively shredded Newton, Scully, Dr. G, and Aztec, let's go ahead and dive into Gebauer. Leo A. Gebauer was a Phoenix-based physical scientist that specialized in magnetics. Gebauer was a known associate and friend of Newton, and one of the inventors, or first to harness the oil-finding devices infamously called the doodlebug. Now quickly, I have seen some reports that state Newton and Gebauer claimed the doodlebug operated off of non-human technology recovered at Aztec. I have never seen any of these statements from Newton, Gebauer, or Scully that claim this. In fact, the doodlebug seemingly has far more basis in scientific reality that we will discuss soon. In his debunk piece, Cahn defiantly stated Gebauer was the sole Dr. G, and Newton had informed him of such. The basis for this claim? None. Gebauer would continuously state in writing, sworn in court, etc., that he was not Dr. G. So Gebauer was not the Mr. G, but was he a Mr. G? This point is extremely interesting, as Gebauer may have been in fact one of the Dr. Gs relaying information to Newton, but like everything with this story, nothing is so simple. In 1986, Steinman would suggest Gebauer and Newton were a targeted leak of information from none other than a real Dr. G, Majestic 12 member, and scientist on site for the Aztec crash, Dr. Carl A. Hyland. Dr. Hyland was the founder and owner of the Hyland Research and Exploration Company based in Denver. Hyland was born in Hamburg, Germany, attended the universities of Heidelberg and Hamburg, gaining his doctorate in the latter in 1923, destined for a career in geology and geophysics. Hyland came to the U.S. in 1935, where he worked as a professor of geophysics at the Colorado School of Mines and operated within the nearby oil fields. During his time in Colorado, Hyland worked alongside many of the scientists we will discuss in this chapter, and more than likely engaged with Leo Gebauer for work on magnetic detection devices, as well as successful Denver-based oilman Silas M. Newton. Some even suggest Hyland was originally the Scientist X supposed to speak at the 1950 University of Denver lecture until Newton took his place. Researchers outside of Steinman have come to the same conclusion, such as one Richard Ogden, who wrote in his 1960s unpublished book that he deduced the field of scientist who could in fact be Dr. G, based on Solly's description, and arrived at one Dr. Carl A. Hyland. After all, Scully would state one of the Mr. Gs lived in Denver and was able to fly to the Aztec crash site in 2 or 3 hours, and that Newton drove with him from Denver to Phoenix. But let's get back to Scully, Newton, Cahn, Gebauer, and the story of the court case. After failing to purchase the saucer story from Scully and Newton, being duped by the copy parts after stealing from Silas, and whether malice or ignorance falsely labeled Dr. G as one Leo Gebauer, J.P. Cahn acted on his vendetta to destroy the Aztec story, both on paper and behind the scenes. This can be confirmed in a 15 June 1952 letter from Scully to the attorney of Silas M. Newton, A. Brigham Rose. The letter discusses Cahn approaching Scully in 1949 when he got wind of Aztec from Scully's Variety magazine article. By 1951, Cahn had tried and failed repeatedly to purchase the story. Cahn quickly became obsessed with Newton and admitted to Scully he had stolen Newton's replica craft material and replaced it with slug. The letter additionally stated by late 1951, Cahn visited Scully, saying he had been duped, claiming Newton and G were to be arrested, that he wanted the hoax exposed and to be written under Scully's name. Otherwise, they would accuse Scully of being involved in the hoax as well. On 25 April 1951, J.P. Cahn wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, regarding Silas Newton. The letter stated that Newton had leaked the Aztec case to Scully and that he was a man with a checkered criminal history. Cahn also tipped off Hoover that Newton was engaged in the preparation of a hoax or swindle of large proportions. Strangely enough, the director of the FBI found time to reply by 3 May 1951, stating the FBI was, quote, to determine if Newton is violating federal statutes in claiming to be engaged in government research of a secret nature or in the perpetration of a hoax or swindle of large proportions, end quote. By 15 May 1951, Cahn responded to Hoover, alerting the director information had been made available to FBI special agents regarding Newton's activities. Now, I find it extremely odd the director of the FBI would find time to reply to a San Francisco Chronicle writer within a month. Perhaps as FBI and CID were conducting sting operations to intercept Aztec photographs in 1950, the Bureau was keen to chase down any leads surrounding the Aztec case. After all, the FBI did have a bizarre file on Newton written roughly 1 year prior on 31 March 1950. This letter, also written to Hoover, stated that allegedly a redacted name was told to have said to another redacted man, Silas Newton, aka Mr. X, had knowledge of a flying disc in recovered bodies. Some of the details here are incorrect, of course. However, it is intriguing the FBI was already keeping tabs on Newton just a few short weeks after his Denver lecture on saucers. And just a few short weeks after, AFOSI interrogated the man who recorded the lecture, George Kohler. I also find it equally fascinating Scott and Suzanne Ramsey pried 289 pages of Silas Newton documents from the FBI, yet the Bureau claimed 100-plus pages were still unreleasable. The FBI did register multiple documents on Newton before Cahn got to them. One file dated 18 February 1941 reported that, quote, Silas Newton had a very substantial income, good character, good habits, and no record of lawsuit, collections, or bankruptcy. Both his companies were reputable concerns, and there was no indication of espionage activities, end quote. Now, of course, the time period of FBI and J. Edgar Hoover investigating Newton does encourage us to reflect on the 1950 Hoddle Memo. On 22 March 1950, J. Edgar Hoover received an official memorandum from Washington Special Agent Guy Hoddle concerning information on flying saucers. The memo discussed information relayed to Special Agent R.H. Kurtzman by Police Special Investigator Carl Howe and his unnamed informant. According to the memo, an Air Force investigator stated 3 flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico, measuring 50 feet in diameter with raised centers, manned by humanoid biologics that measured 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. These saucers were apparently found in New Mexico due to high-powered radar setup in New Mexico interfering with saucer mechanisms. Until this memo was released fully redacted, many thought the source of this information was Newton. While the memo discussed crafts similar to Aztec, albeit off dimension-wise, it is intriguing to continuously hear descriptions of high-powered radar interfering with craft mechanics. Anyways, I digress. Cahn's outreach to the FBI was very successful. Cahn additionally located one Herman Flater, a Denver businessman who had a series of successful, poor, and speculative business deals. Flater had invested large sums of money into Newton's oil wells, which paid him pretty handsome royalties, and the doodlebug, Flater was convinced would make him millions of dollars. Recall the doodlebug was a term used for an electronic sensing equipment device used to find oil, gas, water, and whatever else the inventor claimed the unit could locate. Cahn told Flater, quote,
"You will never see a nickel of your investment because you, my friend, have been victim of a con artist," end quote.
This quote was reported in Frank Scully's book Armor Bright. Over his dealings with Cahn, Flater was convinced the 2 men should seek the FBI to pursue legal action against Newton. In 1951, Flater eventually wished, with the aid of the FBI, to file a criminal case against Newton and his compatriot of the doodlebug, Leo Gebauer, as he decided he felt hustled out of $250,000 by the 2 men. Again odd, as Flater was actively receiving royalties from Newton's successful oil fields. Flater would claim that every time Gebauer utilized the doodlebug machine, he had positive results. However, every time Flater would use the device, nothing happened. Curiously, the FBI could not find one federal judge to entertain a federal criminal case in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, all states in which Newton conducted business. Flater's attorney eventually went to a magistrate in Denver to prosecute the case locally, and charges were filed on 10 October 1952. The initial charges levied at Newton and Gebauer was, quote, interstate transportation of stolen property, end quote, which was defined as Newton transporting Herman Flater's personal checks across state lines to California to deposit them into his bank account. The next charges levied were quote-unquote worthless machinery, which led to the arrest of Gebauer in Phoenix and Newton in Los Angeles on 18 October 1952. Whilst building the case, the FBI found 32 of 33 of Newton and Gebauer's investors were quite pleased with their investments. Flater was the standout pressing charges. The trial started on 10 November 1953, and proceedings lasted until 29 December 1953, when Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer were found guilty of fraud. Based on the work of William Steinman analyzing court records, it is crucial to analyze how this case was prosecuted. Disgruntled businessman Herman Flater was the first prosecution witness to take the stand, presenting his main complaint as his, quote, inability to operate Gebauer's oil-detecting device, end quote. Flater's testimony lasted 2 weeks, and again, he felt as though Newton and Gebauer defrauded him of $250,000. On 17 November 1953, the defense for Gebauer presented, as evidence, a signed contract by Flater that gave him interest in 3 of the oil-detecting devices in return for his investment. Flater strangely denied signing these documents. However, eyewitnesses testified to observing Flater sign. On 20 November 1953, prosecution called Colorado School of Mines geophysics professor Dr. James Meredith to the stand. Meredith was asked, as an expert in geophysical exploration, if he could prove Gebauer's doodlebugs were legitimate tools. Meredith was shown a device that was quote-unquote very similar to Gebauer's oil-detecting tool, but not his device. The device presented in court was one that the district attorney had purchased at a local war surplus store for $4.45 and was, quote, very similar to the one Gebauer used, end quote. The Colorado School of Mines doctor testified regarding the false instrument, quote,
these so-called doodlebugs couldn't detect submarines, much less oil and or gas deposits, end quote.
A second witness, this time a research engineer for the University of Denver, examined the same knockoff devices and testified that it, quote, couldn't find anything, end quote. Now, let's also take a look at the defense here. Defense attorney Melman served Flater with a subpoena, ordering Flater to produce a small health machine he supposedly produced and sold part interest in to Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer. So in the same exchange of interest here to this court case, Flater was buying into the oil detecting device, but Flater was also trying to sell Newton and Gebauer on a nebulous quote-unquote health machine. The judge bizarrely decided that this health machine was not relevant to the case. The second witness called by defense testified with photo evidence that Gebauer had successfully located 3 water wells on his company property. Additional witnesses claimed Gebauer's device had successfully found oil on their 100,000-acre land. Quote, Mr. Gebauer's machine divined 35 oil wells for me. Earlier this year, 1953, I sold 89% in one of these wells for $1.75 million, end quote, testified Oil Tejon Field ranch owner Horace Steele. Quote, I drilled 2 wells on my own initiative after Mr. Gebauer told me not to, on the basis of surveys taken by his machine. Both of these wells turned out dry. I paid Gebauer $10,000 for the complete survey. It was worth every penny, end quote. Mind you, according to court records, J.P. Cahn was on the sideline assisting every step of the way with the prosecution of Gebauer and Newton. In a rather bizarre twist, on 18 December 1953, prosecution called Thor Severson, a Denver Post reporter. Severson had attended Newton's March 1953 university lecture on flying saucers. According to court records, Severson showed a now famous photograph displaying Scully, Newton, and George Kohler and claimed, without evidence, this meeting conspiratorially discussed oil-detecting devices. The confusing trial of Newton and Gebauer eventually came to an end. The two were found guilty of fraud and faced up to 30 years in prison. But the case evaporated. The men were never sentenced and faced no fines. Curiously, Newton agreed to pay a sum of $18,000 to cover court costs, as though this was a civil case, not criminal prosecution. But the damage was done. The Aztec story was officially dead and buried. Cahn's conquest of vengeance had been successful, even though upon his passing, manager of Cahn's estate Robert McClay produced cover art for Cahn's attempts to push more flying saucer stories in the 1960s. With the facts of this case, one must ask, why were Newton and Gebauer even charged? Scott and Suzanne Ramsey argue this court case was punishment to Newton for introducing Dr. G to Scully, wasting Newton's time, delivering him stress, and draining him of tremendous amounts of money. Closer to modern day, many who disclose information on UFO crash retrievals or alien reproduction vehicles face similar reprisals. These include Jonathan Weygandt and Mark McCandlish, both of whom were craftily targeted by the IRS after their disclosures. Now, after that entire long-winded court case section, and before we move on, we must discuss a never-finished autobiography dated 1954, written by Newton and found within the Scully archive by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. Quickly, let's recap what we know about Newton. Newton was born 19 July 1897 and earned a bachelor degree at Baylor, studied at Yale, and performed postgraduate work at the University of Berlin. Newton became a successful oil entrepreneur because of his background as a geophysicist who studied petroleum under the earth. The oil man's relationships would lead him to connect with Leo Gebauer and Dr. G, where Newton both likely heard about the Aztec crash and prototype oil-finding devices. Newton would disclose data of the crash alongside Dr. G to Frank Scully, and even take the place of a lecturer at the University of Denver in 1950. Newton is also a convicted, but never sentenced con man, and as we discussed, there is more than meets the eye to his court case. But what did Newton have to write about himself? Within the manuscript, Newton wrote openly about his friendship with Gebauer and did in fact have a business deal that went south with Denver businessman Herman Flader. Newton saw his University of Denver lecture as the focal point of his entire story. Indeed, the manuscript shows Newton had a deep fascination of magnetics and displayed both an admirable effort to understand the history of magnetism as well as strong conviction flying saucers did indeed operate off of magnetic principles. Again, Newton recounted how he originally was not supposed to speak at this lecture. One of the quote-unquote men of science, likely comprising Dr. G, was to be the lecturer.
Quote, "Some 4 years ago, I dared to stand before an audience in a so-called hall of learning and tell a packed body of students a story I had heard about a phenomenon on which our guardians of space, the Air Force, together with the Air Force of Canada and Great Britain and other nations, have spent millions trying to identify what they term unidentified aerial objects. They also call it quote-unquote Project Blue Book, to give it a proper cloak of mystery here in the USA," end quote.
Newton defiantly stated regarding the lecture, quote,
"As to my talk, it wasn't long before the finger of prosecution began pointing my way, and they've scorched my hide already, but I haven't recanted," end quote.
And while on this subject, a quick note here is well worth referencing. In the 1970s, UFO investigator and former CIA officer Carl Flock claimed to have obtained a diary kept by Silas Newton. This diary allegedly discussed Newton revealing that in the early 1950s, he was contacted by U.S. military officials who wished to speak to him about Aztec. Newton was told the military knew the Aztec story to be bogus. However, they still wished him to spread the story far and wide to whoever would listen. Flock never produced this diary, and after unrelenting pursuit by Scott Ramsey, admitted his source for this diary was Newton's nephew. Now, Newton's sons were both still alive at this time, so one might ask why Newton's nephew would be in possession of the diary. But nevertheless, Flock never produced material evidence of these statements. But back to Newton's manuscript. Silas recalled his tarring and feathering with a rather melancholic tone, writing, quote,
"When the day comes and one of these silent invaders of our skies sets down and we are greeted by the people of another planet, I'm wondering if they too will be stoned in the marketplace. Methinks they already know our ways, and ere they do visit us, they'll be in a position to protect themselves against our gangster methods and our shoot first and investigate afterwards system," end quote.
In the manuscript, Newton would discuss how Canadian radio engineer Wilbert B. Smith had his complete and unwavering admiration for studying flying saucer magnetic propulsion, and this revelation is enormous, and we will soon relate it to SARBACHER. Newton's fascination with magnetics makes perfect sense when we piece together that likely, before World War II, Newton knew select oil and gas scientists who went into top-secret work for Vannevar Bush during World War II. These scientists, as we will discuss soon, would have been an ideal team to study downed UFO saucers found during 1947 to 1950, and Newton would have likely stayed in touch with them to assist in the development of magnetic anomaly detection devices, or MADs, that were then and still are called doodlebugs, and possibly receive first-hand information on UFO crash retrievals along the way. Indeed, according to the Aztec UFO incident, a separate 1950 wire recording archived at the University of Washington saw Newton speak of doing magnetic research in the Mojave Desert with a top magnetic scientist in 1949. In this recording, Newton recalled mentioning reading about flying saucers to the scientist, to which the scientist retorted that he had driven from Denver to Phoenix, and when he drove past New Mexico, he thought he wished Silas Newton was there so he could show Newton where the saucer had landed. According to Newton, the scientist recalled the Rocky Plateau northeast of Aztec and how they, the scientists and the military, had arrived from Durango, Colorado. Miraculously, I do believe I have found this exact wire, or one similar recorded 3 March 1950, so let's listen to Silas himself.
In the summer of 1949, while engaged in magnetic research in the Mojave Desert in California, I was driving one day with one of my associates, who happens to be rated the top magnetic scientist of the United States. In conversation with this gentleman, I had occasion to mention a report about flying saucers. I said, "Doctor, do you happen to know anything about them?" His answer was startling. He said to me, "I thought about you last week when I came down from Denver to Phoenix. When I passed Aztec, New Mexico, I said to my wife, I wish Si was here because I would take him out and show him where the first flying saucer landed in the United States." I said, "Doctor, do you mean to tell me that one of these ships landed and that the American people don't know anything about it?" He said, "Two telescopes saw this flying saucer, or an unidentified ship, and they watched its position on the telescope and estimated approximately where it would land. Within 2 to 3 hours after the landing, Air Force officials reached the flying field at Durango and took off in their search for this object. When they found it, it was in a very rocky, high plateau territory about 16 miles east of Aztec, New Mexico. They immediately threw a guard around it, and about 7 of our magnetic group of scientists were called in to examine this strange ship.
Now, before we move on, I leave you with this powerful quote on page 228 from Newton's manuscript. Quote,
"It appears that I have committed an unpardonable sin when in 1949 I heard of the story of flying saucers, and after months and months of inquiry couldn't break it down, and then told the story, at all times qualifying myself as to it having been told to me, and I can produce literally dozens of people in Colorado and California who have heard the story from the same source I got it. Mr. Scully has not been branded a hoaxer. I have, however, not only been libeled and lied about, but I have been pictured as the deliberate author of the whole idea. And to follow it up, the same people who defamed me in print then framed up a prosecution that even at this hour seems to me like some horrible nightmare from which I will awaken in time." End quote.
The Ramseys and myself share the sentiment the trial of Newton and Gebauer was targeted retaliation for leaking information about the Aztec case. William Steinman presents a far more dramatic and consequential reason for the court case of Newton and Gebauer. These conclusions will also lead us to discuss in depth the doodlebug, which may just be the linchpin of the whole case, tying in together Aztec, Mr. G, Newton, Scully, Gebauer, and possibly the Majestic 12. Recall how Steinman's investigation and sources led him to conclude Dr. Carl A. Hyland was not only one of the real Mr. Gs, but also an MJ-12 member and first-hand participant to the Aztec UFO crash. Dr. Carl Hyland owned the Hyland Research and Exploration Company based in Denver, Colorado. Steinman claims Hyland's business was quite familiar with devices used for detecting oil wells and water, and that Gebauer had even consulted with Hyland's company. Steinman's theory goes Hyland and Gebauer sought ways to test modified and developed magnetic aerial detection equipment from World War II anti-submarine programs, and thus the two engaged with oil man Silas Newton. In fact, Steinman argued Hyland and Gebauer were not only acquaintances, but also research compatriots. In his book, Steinman infers Gebauer and Hyland worked and lived together in 1935 in Antarctica for a U.S. government research project. According to the researcher, the two would later be involved with top-secret development of magnetic aerial detection anti-submarine technology, and then post-war, adapt such technology back to underground oil, gas, water, and/or other detection. I should, however, note Steinman does not offer exhibits of evidence or context around these statements, so while I have no reason to doubt him here, we still cannot prove Hyland and Gebauer 100% worked and lived alongside one another. Furthermore, Steinman would also claim Gebauer worked at the Phoenix and Los Angeles division of Air Research Company. Recall how Air Research Company and its founder, Dr. Paul Scherrer, a colleague of Vannevar Bush and member of the Research and Development Board, was allegedly called to action to provide freezing equipment to preserve the Aztec bodies. Another interesting connection that I find little to back up, however, it should be mentioned the Ramseys additionally stated Gebauer had served high positions within the Air Research Laboratories around 1946, according to Better Business Bureau records. But back to Hyland. Hyland was involved in early uses of the magnetometer for both geophysical exploration purposes and for detecting submarines during World War II. Steinman argued Hyland was the initial source of the Aztec leak, disclosing information, photographs, materials, etc. to Newton and Gebauer. When the Majestic 12, or whatever UFO Legacy Program entity was controlling dissemination of information around this time found out, Hyland was forced to withdraw from the March 1950 University of Denver lecture where scientist X, Silas Newton, took his place.
Quote, "Since Dr. Carl A. Hyland was considered by MJ-12 to be the unintentional source of the original security leak, they contacted him in private, briefing him on their versions of the courtroom trial, and suggested a way for him to make amends. They asked him to appear as an expert witness against Gebauer in order to disprove the authenticity of Gebauer's electromagnetic oil-finding devices. Hyland explained to his visitor that he could not do so with a clear conscience, and look Gebauer in the eye, knowing that they had both developed these devices together." End quote.
This ultimately, according to the theory, led to Dr. James Meredith, a co-worker of Hyland at the Colorado School of Mines Geophysics Department, to testify against Gebauer with fraudulent devices. Recall how Steinman connected the Doodlebug with World War II submarine detecting equipment. This is where our story gets incredibly strange, and perhaps there is more to the inappropriately named Doodlebug than meets the eye. Remember, several witnesses testified in support of Gebauer and Newton that their device was indeed successful at finding oil or water deposits. Gebauer's device, if real, may have been an early iteration of a magnetic anomaly detection device, or MAD, and this device, like Steinman proposed, could have connected Gebauer and Newton to the Aztec saucer. Newton and Gebauer, as stated in Newton's never-finished autobiography, were familiar with scientists before the Second World War who were working on finding oil-finding devices that transitioned to work under Vannevar Bush for secretive submarine detection missions in both theaters of World War II. After all, according to Scully, the Dr. G scientists were quote-unquote top shelf and worked on secretive projects during the Second World War. Scully additionally labeled some of the Dr. Gs as working out the means by which Japanese submarines were detected by magnetic devices. So let's really pull on this thread here. In 1930, a company was founded by Dr. J. Clarence Karcher and Eugene McDermott called Geophysical Services, Inc.
Quote, "Karcher was an American geophysicist and businessman who invented the reflection seismograph, applying for patents in 1919. He eventually commercialized the process by which most of the world's oil reserves were discovered. McDermott was a geophysicist and pioneer of providing seismic services to the petroleum industry. The original GSI was founded in 1930 to offer the first ever reflection seismograph exploration services to the oil industry." End quote.
In 1917, when John Karcher revealed his formula for calculating the depth of subsurface formations, he knew he had developed something very important. His discovery led to a plan for someday using seismic waves to map structures far below the Earth's surface. The oil-producing world would come to know the reflection seismograph as the instrument which fulfilled that plan.
I do not think it is any stretch here to assume GSI sought prolific and successful oil men in the American Southwest, like Silas Newton, to test their groundbreaking products. By 1939, the founders of GSI started another company, which acted as GSI's parent company called the Colorado Corporation. The purpose here was to keep GSI in the reflection seismograph business exploring oil and gas, whilst the Colorado Corps could continue to branch into new ventures. By 1941, Eugene McDermott, along with several key employees, purchased GSI from Colorado Corp. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, GSI and the reflection seismograph technologies were recruited to secretive projects for anti-submarine warfare.
The National Defense Research Council was setting up the organizations through which university and industry people were to be pulled together to tackle specific jobs in technology and design for the war effort. GSI had a hidden asset: its long experience in building sophisticated electronic equipment for its own use. This experience and Johnson's frequent trips to Washington led to some engineering and development tasks for the Army Signal Corps and a contract for airborne magnetic submarine detectors for the Navy.
By 1942, GSI had become a DoD contractor in Navy war production engineering, specifically focused on using their technology for submarine detection. GSI was recruited by the Office of Scientific Research and Development, an office set up by the U.S. government during World War II to, quote, engage the brightest scientific minds and the great machinery of industry in the pursuit of victory, end quote. The head of this OSRD was, of course, accused MJ1 and lead scientist for the Aztec crash, Dr. Vannevar Bush. Working under Vannevar Bush, the OSRD, and Navy War Department, GSI was divided into 4 groups: the Laboratory Manufacturing Division, Apparatus Division, Equipment Group, and Defense Systems and Electronics Group, aka DSEG. So hold on here and let's get this straight. GSI was developing oil-detecting devices used possibly by Silas M. Newton before being recruited in World War II by Dr. Vannevar Bush and the OSRD in order to adapt their technology for anti-submarine programs. This ties in perfectly to the statements made by Steinman and Scully in their publishing. But that's not all here, and far from it. GSI would later on in 1951 become Texas Instruments, a contractor accused of housing UFO legacy program operations. It is comical to me how Texas Instruments themselves refer to legendary GSI geophysicists, geologists, engineers, scientists, and others who performed seismic survey tasks as doodlebuggers. But as GSI sounds like a perfect corporation that fits the description of the workplace of one, if not multiple Mr. G's, are there any former GSI employees that really fit our conditions? One possible source of Dr. G was GSI co-founder Eugene McDermott. McDermott was a luminary and genius, himself registering 5 of the early GSI patents that greatly earned the respect of Vannevar Bush. If Bush did indeed spearhead the Aztec retrieval, a trusted and respected genius like McDermott would make an obvious candidate for a scientist on the team. McDermott was active with GSI since its inception in the 1930s, when GSI was largely working with oil and gas detection, possibly working and allowing Newton and Gebauer to test their technologies. McDermott was revered by his employees, such as Cecil Green, who would go on to serve as president and chairman when GSI became Texas Instruments. In a comical statement relevant to the subject of UFOs, according to Green, McDermott had extreme skills in reverse engineering almost anything he was given. The co-founder of GSI, J. Clarence Karcher, makes an additional possibility for a Mr. G, as he originally applied for patents in reflection seismology in 1921. According to an engraved monument, quote, proved the validity of the reflection seismograph as a useful tool in the search for oil, end quote. While not directly an employee of GSI, we have already discussed Carl Hyland and how he possibly leaked the Aztec story to his compatriot Leo Gebauer. Additionally outside, but possibly tangential to GSI, we have 2 Mr. G's of interest, Otto German Arnold Schmidt and John Terence Tate. Schmidt was an accomplished expert of biophysics, bioengineering, electrical engineering, and magnetism. In 1937, Schmidt even performed research at the Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory, which I have previously connected to undersea UFO crash retrievals. By March 1941, Schmidt was appointed by Dr. Vannevar Bush as the official investigator for the National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC. Shortly after, the NDRC evolved into Bush's famous OSRD, or the Office of Scientific Research and Development. As we discussed with GSI, the role of OSRD in World War II was clearly defined, a hard military focus helmed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Schmidt would join John Torrance Tate retrofitting PBY Catalina amphibious bombers with magnetic detecting equipment known as MAD, Magnetic Anomaly Detector, later referred to as Magnetic Airborne Detector Device. As we mentioned earlier, Gebauer's device could have possibly existed as early iterations of the Magnetic Anomaly Detector. However, conclusions drawn by the fantastic research of the Ramseys point specifically to John Torrance Tate as a likely Mr. G. Quote, "He had more degrees than a thermometer and had received them from such diverse institutions as the Armour Institute, Creighton University, and the University of Berlin. He is the scientist I have called Dr. G." End quote. Frank Scully, when discussing one of these scientists known as Dr. G. Tate earned his master's degree in physics and electrical engineering at the University of Omaha, nestled in Nebraska alongside Creighton University, and earned his doctorate at the University of Berlin. During World War I, quote, Tate and his colleagues verified the existence of discrete energy levels and showed that there was a difference in the amount of energy required to spur radiation and the amount of energy that is needed for ionization. This helped connect Bohr's theory and those of Heisenberg and Schrödinger in quantum mechanics, end quote. During the Second World War, Tate was recruited by Vannevar Bush to work for anti-submarine programs with the NDRC, which would later on become the OSRD. Tate would enjoy prestigious positions during the war, including scientific advisor for the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, Assistant Chief of the Office of Field Services of OSRD, and the Director of Operations, Research, and Chief Member of the Rocket Ordnance Division and National Defense Research Committee. In July of 2011, Scott and Suzanne Ramsey traveled to the University of Minnesota at Minneapolis to study archival material on Tate's life and work. Here they found evidence Tate had actually traveled to the Southwest at the time of Aztec.
Quote, "In front of a large audience, Tate stated that during a recent trip, he had experienced something that had changed his life. According to him, what he had seen could change the way that energy is generated, how food is produced, and overall how humanity could be served. This was a complete reversal of his normal retiring attitude," end quote.
From Hyland to Tate and Dr. G's relation to Newton and Gebauer, this chapter has served to attempt to unveil at least some of the nebulous Dr. G and also demonstrate Gebauer's doodlebug was not a fanciful object bought for $4.45 at a surplus store, but instead based on real technology from real scientists, many of whom were connected with Geophysical Services, Inc., that would bridge the technology for submarine detection equipment in World War II and foster close relationships with Vannevar Bush. Thus far, we have discussed the Aztec crash according to our primary sources outlined at the start of this project. I do want to spend a little bit of time narrowing in on some of the work Steinman did in his 1986 epic, UFO Crash at Aztec, A Well-Kept Secret. This enormous book only saw 1,000 copies printed, and as I stated at the beginning of this project, I have purchased a copy for high-quality scans for this video. In his book, Steinman revolutionized the Aztec case by mentioning the IPU MJ-12 and actually identifying the team of scientists he claimed were present for the crash recovery, including Vannevar Bush, von Neumann, Hyland, etc. Now, as much as I love this book and want to praise it, Steinman remained throughout the book somewhat cagey about his sources and origins of information. Examples include definitive mention Leo Gebauer and Hyland worked alongside one another without evidence, and involvement of the IPU without firmly stating his sourcing or rationale. So, as we have been doing, we must try and draw our own parallels and conclusions based upon the research presented. Steinman became intrigued with Behind the Flying Saucers after he once read about the Aztec case in Stringfield's UFO Crash Retrieval Status Reports 1-7. The researcher wrote his epic based upon the foundation the Aztec crash was true, but started back at square one to derive his own sources and methods. Viewers of my channel know I reference often and hold a great deal of respect for Steinman, a true researcher who admirably cold contacted many figures associated with UFO legacy programs and crash retrievals. The case portrayed by Steinman is remarkably similar to the case discussed by Scully, Newton, and several Aztec witnesses completely disconnected from the original Aztec reporting crew. So, no, Sean Kirkpatrick, there is no circular reporting here. The major difference in Steinman's reporting is how access was gained to the craft. Thus far, we have heard different testimony of oilfield workers to the recovery team exploiting an existing hole in one of the craft's portholes to open a doorway in the vehicle. Steinman's account states one of the accredited scientists on site observed a knob-shaped protrusion with a button in the middle through one of the craft portholes. The unnamed scientist thus ordered for the team to pick up hammers and beat the porthole glass out. Then we return to what we have heard already, where the team used a long pole to poke around in the craft and eventually open it. Intriguing to me in this passage here is Steinman's reporting Bush's team attempted myriad solutions to disassemble the enormous craft for removal, cutting torches, diamond drills, diamond cutting saws, and more, but no device would phase the metal, let alone penetrate the material.
Quote, finally, one scientist, after a very thorough examination, found a place on the inside where there was some sort of interlocking key device. When he pulled on the device, a seam opened up on the ship at that particular location from top to bottom. He continued around the ship and found several of these devices at equally spaced intervals. Here was the key to disassembly problem that they had been looking for, end quote.
Again, I am strongly reminded of the words of Director of Naval Intelligence and BDM board member Sumner Shapiro. In his work, Steinman professed to contain knowledge of personnel brought in to study the craft over a year after its recovery, but unfortunately, he did not detail where and how he obtained this data, but it is nevertheless worth our time to study. Steinman stated, a little over a year and a half after the recovery, November of 1949 to be exact, Dr. Eric Henry Wang was called onto the project. Now, does this name sound familiar to anyone? Wang worked as a consultant to the Wright Air Development Center on aerodynamic metallurgical design for the Structure Division and served on the staff for the University of Cincinnati. Wang was also one of the key scientific figures mentioned along the 1953 Kingman, Arizona crash retrieval. I previously made a video on Kingman, one of my all-time favorite crash retrieval events, and of course, Wang was mentioned.
You know, David gave them first-hand direct information from his sources of where to look, where to find the spacecraft.
Yes.
Where to literally go and open the door. Oh, by the way, there's a spacecraft recovered from Aztec.
Yeah.
Open this door. Oh, yeah, that's the one from Kingman.
If Wang really was involved with Aztec, perhaps his efforts to understand the craft were indeed successful, seen as during Kingman while spearheading the Office of Special Studies at Wright-Patterson Airfield. Wang was suspected of leading the reverse engineering team on the crashed non-human craft. As I said in my Kingman video, which still holds true, Wang has proved exceedingly difficult to track down, almost as if he was erased from public record. All I can prove with Wang is that he was indeed the head of the Office of Special Studies at Wright-Pat and involved with Operation Upshot Knothole, the nuclear test thought to have been the impetus of the Kingman's craft's crash. All the way back in 1986, Steinman understandably found difficulty digging up info on Wang, thus believing the Majestic 12 wished to keep their prize scientist off public record. Steinman was able to wrangle up tiny references to Wang, his obituary for example, in the April 1961 edition of Mechanical Engineering magazine. The obituary shed more light on this enigmatic figure possibly connected to Aztec and Kingman. Wang hailed from Austria, and after earning his degrees and teaching in Cincinnati, Ohio, Wang began work on secret government projects in 1949 at Wright Development Center. In 1956, Wang's department was moved to Sandia Laboratory Complex at Kirtland Air Force Base, where he remained until his death. Remember, Sandia and Kirtland are two of the most critical names in my research on UFO Legacy Program operation locations. Admirably, Steinman contacted an individual in Albuquerque who knew Wang very well. The individual was mentioned only by the name MW. MW stated Wang's personal papers were all confiscated by military intelligence upon his death, placed behind lock and key of a highly secretive section of the library at Kirtland Air Force Base. Wishing to discuss saucers off a line that was likely being tampered with, Steinman and MW planned to exchange letters. Steinman never heard back from MW, but did notice his mail being tampered with and a tracking device stuck to his van. Unfortunately, the enigma that is Dr. Eric Wang persists today. Who was Wang? Was he called in to assist with the Aztec crash in regards to study and duplication? And did he spearhead the 1953 Kingman crash recovery? Historically, the Aztec case has rested solely on the credibility of Silas Newton. Since he is a convicted con man, though the story is not that simple, the whole case has been labeled by publications such as the ever-reliable Wikipedia as a hoax. But are there eyewitnesses to the crash? Are there individuals who saw the disc, touched the disc, or perhaps participated in the retrieval firsthand? Well, thanks to the tireless work of Steinman and the Ramseys, yes indeed, we do. And let's briefly explore a few here. Valentin Archuleta initially disclosed his testimony to William Steinman in 1982 under the pseudonym V.A. Archuleta served in World War II and was deployed to the harrowing Eastern Theater in the Philippines. Archuleta was captured, but miraculously survived the horrific Japanese POW camps. After the war, Archuleta served as a rancher in Aztec, New Mexico. Valentin claimed early one morning between 1948 to 1950, he was out performing his usual chores. The rancher heard a large explosion. Looking in the direction of the sound, Archuleta observed a huge, disc-shaped craft, larger than his house, with a dome on top, pass within 200 yards of him overhead. This disc appeared to be in trouble, skimming as low as 100 feet over the ground and wobbled as it careened overhead. Valentin described the disc striking the corner of a 150-foot cliff face, shooting sparks and rocks in every direction. The Ramseys have sought and believed to have found this location. Archuleta proceeded to call the military in Albuquerque, aka Kirtland Air Force Base, a base I have on myriad occasions associated with UFO crash retrieval operations. Valentin requested the Air Force call him back to explain what was happening, but was never contacted again. Now, paramount to the whole Aztec story is, of course, oil. Recall all the way back to the beginning of this video when we described the event. Oil workers were some of the first civilians on scene. In 1948, 19-year-old Doug Noland worked for the El Paso Oil Company. Early one morning, Noland was on his way to pick up his supervisor Bill Ferguson to proceed to a grueling day of work in the oil field south of Aztec. Bill informed Doug a brush fire had started on Hart Canyon Road, 12 miles northeast of Aztec. Since this fire was supposedly burning near some of the company's oil drip tanks, the two dispatched towards the area. Arriving to the tanks, Bill and Doug were greeted by several other oil workers already on scene to investigate. The two were told something strange was sitting atop the hill.
Quote, "The craft was extremely large. We realized the craft was smooth with no noticeable seams, rivets, bolts, or weld marks. It looked as if it was molded. The craft was brushed aluminum, looking to be very smooth, but not highly polished aluminum like you would see on an airplane." End quote.
Doug and the other men climbed atop the craft, resting at an angle on the mesa, looking for some sort of entry point. The men found a small porthole-type feature atop the dome. Quote,
"The windows or portholes looked like mirrors until you would get closer. Then you could see right through them." End quote.
Just as the Aztec story goes, Doug stated one porthole featured a hole no bigger than the size of a quarter. Inside the craft, Doug would claim to see two bodies, quote, slumped over what appeared to be a control panel of sorts, end quote.
Quote, "By the time the local law enforcement showed up, Bill, who was ignoring the orders to stay away from the craft, was trying to poke around the craft with a fire pole or something he pulled off one of the trucks. Soon, he hit something, and a door or walkway appeared. Some of us had to look inside and see what else was in there and if anyone was in need of help." End quote.
The small bodies inside were charred a dark brown, likely burned to a crisp, but the craft's interior was undamaged. Doug described the disc as 100 feet across, describing the craft as having a very thin cross-section, only 18 to 20 feet high and very thin at the edges. Doug did describe some strange markings on the outer edge of the craft. gold color rings, 3 if I remember correctly, that ran around the entire outer edge of the disk, end quote. Quite a number of locals began to arrive to the scene, according to Noland, including cattle ranchers Mr. and Mrs. Knight, who warned the oil workers to get away from the disk. Doug's testimony recounts the circling of a helicopter overhead, which stood out to him almost as bizarrely as the disk. A law enforcement officer, now identified as Manuel Sandoval from the nearby Cuba, New Mexico, arrived on scene, claiming he had followed the low-flying disk in a northerly direction. Similar to Archuleta, Sandoval described seeing the craft as wobbly and fluttering like a leaf. The policeman quickly took initiative, ordering locals off the craft. More men, including a local officer, pulled to the scene who informed Sandoval the military was well aware of the craft and that everybody should leave the area at once. The military eventually showed up, in Doug's words, in a very big way. Doug was impressed with how fast the uniformed men showed to scene. He was unaware if the men were USAF or Army, as the two were recently separated, but their vehicles did, according to Doug, look Army. Now, these men were not young guys, according to Doug's eyes. They appeared seasoned, assertive, and well-trained, possibly IPU, if Steinman's theories are correct. The military on scene quickly assembled everyone present and divided the people for interview. The uniformed men told Doug, and presumably others, quote,
"This event was extremely important to the United States, that we were responsible for our national security, and that we will never talk to anyone about this event," end quote.
Other eyewitnesses described almost identical crash sites to Scott Ramsey. These include Ken Farley, who while on his deathbed in 1999, disclosed to Ramsey. Farley was visiting his aunt in Durango, Colorado, north of Aztec, and was on his way to Cedar Hill, New Mexico, to see a friend the early morning of 25 March 1948. After his friend suggested they check out a lot of activity on a nearby dirt road, the two drove to Hart Canyon Road. Following the dust and dirt clouds from other cars, the two men got out and walked on top of the mesa. The two men saw a huge object, with people ranging from oil field workers to an older couple, possibly the Knights, walking around the craft.
Quote, "We saw a large, disc-shaped object, aluminum in color, but not really very shiny, sort of dull aluminum. I could not see any structures as far as doors or windows. The entire craft was very smooth. The craft did not appear to have any damage, but lay on the mesa at a funny angle and sort of rested on its belly. The disc had a bubble or protrusion on the bottom from what I can remember, and also one on the top. It sort of reminded me of two pie pans with a bubble for a top and bottom. The top bubble was larger than the bottom. The craft was lying at an angle, maybe 12 degrees or so," end quote.
Ken described the scene. Two police officers on site, likely Sandoval and the local officer, were asking folks to leave. Oil field workers were climbing all over the craft, and an old couple, again the Knights, yelled at the men to get off. Shortly after, according to Ken, disgruntled military personnel arrived whisking people off site. In a truly incredible turn of events, the Ramseys have located two Aztec witnesses on the side of the recovery efforts. In 2001, Scott Ramsey interviewed a USAF veteran by the pseudonym George. Ramsey states the identity of George was known by multiple researchers, including the legendary Stanton Friedman. George claimed to be stationed as an airman of the Walker Air Force Base in 1948, formerly known as the infamous Roswell Army Airfield. George claimed the Aztec retrieval was indeed coordinated out of Walker AFB, perfectly suited after Roswell Army Airfield had garnered experience retrieving non-human craft solely 8 months prior. George explained to Scott Ramsey the retrieval operation was highly compartmentalized, with information restricted to a need-to-know basis concerning the work to which each individual was assigned, similar to the Manhattan Project. George's directive was to keep personnel records for everyone who was working the recovery. Quote,
"If you count everyone, and I mean everyone, then you are talking about 200 people," end quote.
Though he was not in the loop on everything, far from it in fact, George claimed to see daily intelligence reports concerning progress made and people involved. George stated the retrieval process took every part of 2 weeks. Quote,
"Look, you have a large group of highly trained people that are doing an extraordinary project. We keep records to show you may be in Florida, maybe even have you in the infirmary for a sprained ankle from playing volleyball, a sprained back from the bowling alley. Do you get my drift? See, now years later you run your mouth off, saying you worked on this, you worked on that, and the Air Force says BS. He was in Florida that month and we can prove it. Here is his medical file. He was treated for a sprained ankle that week. Now do you see how it's done? End quote.
Now, of course, if you've been paying attention, there is an issue here. If Dr. Carl Hyland was indeed present at Aztec, George failed his duties as the Ramseys were able to place Hyland in the American Southwest at the time of Aztec. George recalled the Air Force, based out of Walker Air Force Base and Army 5th Base out of Colorado, as well as a few other select bases or locations were involved in the crash, and recall how Steinman stated the U.S. Army Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit arrived to the Aztec crash from Camp Hale, Colorado. And while we're here, let's reference back to the U.S. Army CID/FBI sting operation conducted in 1950 to purchase Aztec crash photographs. Far removed from Newton, Scully, or any of the main characters of the Aztec case, official memorandums discussing the sting reference the 5th Army Intelligence Division Regional Office being involved in receiving information and interviewing witnesses surrounding the sting. George claimed the personnel involved in the recovery were highly trained and seasoned, similar to the IPU claims of Steinman and eyewitness testimony of Doug Noland.
Quote, "Look, they had the recovery back in 1947. They blew it. They put the thing out, tried to cover it up. From that time on, no more screw-ups." End quote.
We can take this away from George's testimony. The issues with the Roswell recovery led to Aztec featuring new people and new procedures, and though George was not privy to policy, the Aztec proceedings were handled by highly trained professionals. He had no direct knowledge, but George wagered the craft was taken to Los Alamos. After the event, George noticed a tremendous amount of equipment at the then Atomic Energy Commission lab, including flatbed and lowboy trucks. Interesting here, George also claimed to see photos of the craft, as of course did Scully's wife, and as we know, elements of the US DoD and IC were interested in intercepting such images. Possibly paramount to our entire investigation, Ramsey asked George if the Air Force was upset with Scully, who wrote the first book on Aztec, and a bestseller at that.
Quote, "They weren't upset with Scully. They were concerned with who leaked the story to Scully." End quote.
If George's account is true, this tremendously strengthens the argument Newton and Gebauer were put through grueling trial as punishment for leaking the story. Tangential to our story today, but just as Aztec was born from Scully's Behind the Flying Saucers, so too did the book give rise to the testimony of one of the most critically overlooked characters in all of UFO lore, Dr. Robert Sarbacher. In 1950, Canadian government senior radio engineer Wilbert B. Smith wrote to the Controller of Telecommunications in the Department of Transport requesting for Canada to begin its first official investigation into UFOs, specifically studying complex magnetism as a form of propulsion. This document was never supposed to be public. The classification of this document was likely accidentally downgraded. The document was classified top secret until 15 September 1969 and remained largely hidden until UFO researchers Arthur Bray and Stanton Friedman obtained a copy in 1978. In this letter, Smith made 3 astounding claims told to him by a source within Washington regarding UFOs.
1. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, higher even than the H-bomb. 2. Flying saucers exist. 3. Their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated efforts are being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. And 4. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance.
Wilbert Smith, a man whom Silas Newton shared a tremendous amount of respect for, would go on to spearhead Canada's first 2 UFO programs, Projects Magnet and Second Story. Smith was possibly even exposed to technologies of unknown origin by U.S. government officials, but of course, that is not our story today. The source of Wilbert B. Smith for this profound memo, 1 Dr. Robert Sarbacher. Sarbacher served as a respected physicist and consultant to Vannevar Bush's and the DoD's Research and Development Board in the 1950s under the Truman administration. The esteemed Harvard graduate and student of Einstein served as the founder and dean of Georgia Institute of Technology, director of research at WED Labs, scientific consultant to the U.S. Marines, and as mentioned earlier, involved in the Joint Research and Development Board. Sarbacher's research specialized in remote-controlled rockets, though, curiously, Sarbacher has largely been wiped from the annals of history, similar to Dr. Eric Henry Wang. On 15 September 1950, Wilbert Smith interviewed Robert Sarbacher. Smith stated he had read Scully's Behind the Flying Saucers and wished to know how much of the book was fact, to which Sarbacher replied, quote, "The facts reported in the book are substantially correct," end quote. The two would discuss magnetic propulsion systems behind UFOs before Smith's source would inform Smith of the shocking points made in the 1950 memo. Beginning his research on Aztec, after being struck by Behind the Flying Saucers, William Steinman quickly attempted to track down Robert Sarbacher. The accomplished physicist stated he himself had no association with any of the people involved with UFO crash recoveries and had no specifics on dates of successful recoveries. However, Sarbacher had been invited to participate in several discussions regarding recoveries whilst consulting with the R&D board but was never given access to personally attend. Sarbacher still did attest meetings regarding UFO crash retrievals were held by the Military Research and Development Board at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and involved figures such as John von Neumann, Vannevar Bush, and Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, three key U.S. scientists and three figures linked to the Aztec crash. Though he did not receive materials or photographs, Sarbacher had been privy to UFO crash reports during his official Pentagon duties. In the direct words of Sarbacher, quote,
"About the only thing I remember at this time is that certain materials reported to have come from flying saucer crashes were extremely light and very tough. I am sure our laboratories analyzed them very carefully. There were reports that instruments or people operating these machines were also very lightweight, sufficient to withstand the tremendous deceleration and acceleration associated with their machinery. I remember in talking with some of the people at the office that I got the impression these quote-unquote aliens were constructed like certain insects we've observed on Earth, wherein because of the low mass, the inertial forces involved in operation of these instruments would be quite low. I still do not know why the higher order of classification has been given and why the denial of the existence of these devices," end quote.
Obviously, Sarbacher's described lightweight materials closely resemble the metals described from the Roswell and Aztec wreckage. And we do, of course, have a possible paper trail of custody here. As in my video on Battelle Memorial Institute, I discussed the contractor receiving pieces of the Roswell wreckage to test on the now coveted material used in many industries such as aerospace and medical, nitinol. However, Sarbacher's description of biologics do somewhat differ here. Certainly, the biologics described in Aztec and Roswell sound far more humanoid than insect, but this could attest to the likelihood multiple non-human species have visited and crashed on the planet. As we continue, I would strongly suggest reading the book by Grant Cameron, UFOs, Area 51, and Government Informants. On a future unknown date, Steinman would write to UFO researcher Grant Cameron. The letter would discuss friend of Cameron and Steinman, the legendary Stanton Friedman, had also tracked down Sarbacher in 1983. According to Sarbacher, quote,
"I did not attend the meetings at Wright Field concerning the recovered saucers, but there was one person who attended all of the meetings. I can't remember his name. He wrote a book on electrical engineering, was a member of the RDB, and was the head of the electrical engineering department at a university in Pennsylvania," end quote.
Based on this statement, Steinman did some digging on his own volition and derived a name. Steinman received direct confirmation of this name, another one of the most under-discussed names in all of UFO lore and usual of this channel. One Dr. Eric A. Walker. I'm sure he needs no introduction here, but let's alongside Sarbacher discuss Dr. Eric A. Walker. The genius that was Dr. Walker was born in 1910. He received his BS in engineering in 1932, MBA in 33, and his DSc in 35, all from Harvard University. In his early professional years, Walker would teach mathematics and electrical engineering at Tufts College. Walker would then join the University of Connecticut, where he taught electrical engineering and initiated courses for a special war training program. It is widely thought that here is where Walker met Dr. Vannevar Bush and likely became initiated into UFO programs. During the Second World War, the doctor would join the Underwater Sound Laboratory at Harvard University, where he would quickly find himself in charge of ordnance, specifically weapons. The accomplished scientist's studies in Underwater Sound Lab led to the creation of the homing torpedo, which saw Walker be awarded with the Naval Ordnance Development Award and a Presidential Certificate of Merit. By 1944, Walker would join Vannevar Bush's Office of Scientific Research and Development, and by 1945, Walker would join Penn State University, which he would later become president of. It was at Penn State, at the behest of the Navy, Walker would create the Applied Research Laboratory, now a DoD-designated U.S. Navy UARC, or University Affiliated Research Center. Now, I talk in extreme detail in most of my projects about UARCs and their semi-private corporate counterparts, FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers. Involvement in UFO legacy program operations, so reference any of these projects for more on that topic. Recall how SARBACHER said in 1950, as consultant to the Defense Research Board, UFO crash retrieval meetings were held at Wright-Patterson by the R&D board spearheaded by Vannevar Bush. Well, in that same year of 1950, Walker sat on the R&D board and would later go on to serve as its executive secretary from 1950 to 1952. Indeed, Stanton Friedman's sharp eye uncovered an early 1950s document from the Department of the Army to chairman of the U.S. Communications Intelligence Board, USCIB. The subject of this document is, quote, Indoctrination for Special Intelligence for Mr. Eric Arthur Walker, end quote. Walker would go on to assist in many DoD and IC projects, including Project Azorian in 1972, to recover the sunken Soviet submarine K-129 at the behest of the National Underwater Reconnaissance Office. Now this is interesting, as I have directly connected the vessel used, the Glomar Explorer, and the highly secretive Neuro to undersea UFO crash retrieval operations, and I highly recommend viewing that project. Throughout the 1980s, the name Dr. Eric A. Walker was kept secret by select UFO investigators, such as Stanton Friedman and William Steinman, in hopes the doctor could be convinced to publicly disclose his involvement in UFO crash retrievals and material exploitation programs. William Steinman first reached out to Dr. Walker on 19 March 1948. Walker's response was bizarre, to say the least. Dr. Walker typed on the lower portion of Steinman's sent letter, and the doctor even cut off Steinman's return address and stamped it on the front of his envelope. The correspondence read, in all caps, quote,
Stop. Don't try and find me. I came on that machine. I will leave May 15, ergo, quiet, 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 end quote.
Steinman would attempt to contact Walker again on 31 May 1984 with no response. But on 30 August 1987, the ever-persistent Steinman would call Walker, and to his surprise, Walker answered. Straight to the punch, Steinman told Walker he wished to speak on meetings at Wright-Patterson in 49 to 50 concerning military recoveries of flying saucers and their occupants. Just as shocking as Walker even answering the call, he would state, quote, Yes, I attended meetings concerning that subject matter.
Why do you want to know about that? End quote.
In this 1987 conversation, Walker would reveal he knew of the Majestic 12. In fact, he had for 40 years, so all the way back to 1947. Then gave Steinman a bizarre reference to Don Quixote, quote,
I believe that you're chasing after windmills and fighting with windmills.
Walker told Steinman the researcher's efforts were futile, but still the doctor would see if he could wrangle up any of the 1950 Wright-Patterson notes. But to this day, I have heard nothing of these notes making their way to the public. Now, I know I'm spending a significant amount of time on Walker and SARBACHER, but the fact behind the flying saucers containing the Aztec story led to the discovery of two of the most critical and understudied individuals in the subject is paramount to our investigation. Several UFO researchers would approach Walker in the late 1980s, but few were able to speak with him. In conversations with Henry Azadehel, aka Armin Victorian, Walker would reveal he was present for the 1965 Kecksburg, Pennsylvania UFO Crash Retrieval, an all-time favorite case of mine. Walker would tell Victorian, quote,
"Only a couple people are capable of handling this issue. Unless your mind ability is like Einstein's or likewise, I do not think you can achieve anything," end quote.
Walker would even bring up ESP, extrasensory perception, stating, quote,
"How good is your sixth sense? How much do you know about ESP, unless you know about it and how to use it? You would not be taken in. Only a few know about it," end quote.
Believe it or not, we could spend another 2 hours here on Walker and cover perplexing coded letters returned to Steinman, 1988 conversations with T. Scott Crane stating Walker would no longer speak on UFOs, and much more. What secrets could Walker have possibly held onto regarding Aztec? My wager many, as Walker joined the DRB 1 year following the incident, 1949. Integral to Steinman's 1986 reconstruction of the Aztec retrieval is the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, or IPU as we will call it from here on out. I have discussed the IPU many times before, including speaking on the documents with Ryan Wood, who has served alongside his late father, Dr. Robert Wood, as the premier researchers attempting to authenticate or disprove the Majestic 12 documents. Since the IPU is so integral to piecing together the retrieval, let's spend some time reviewing the infamous Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. Now, frustratingly, Steinman never presented strong evidence for why IPU, stationed out of Camp Hale, Colorado, was the on-site military team securing the craft and Crash LZ, only reporting the word from sources. Steinman was, however, one of the trailblazing researchers to prove the IPU's existence. Like just about everything related to Majestic 12, or UFO crash retrievals, IPU is not without controversy. Researchers such as Brad Sparks and Kevin Randall have professed quote-unquote truth about the IPU, claiming this unit was no more than the input processing unit of Army Intelligence, later Army AFSTC, Foreign Science and Technology Center. Basically, IPU was the incoming documents mailroom for Army S&T post-Sputnik in the 1968 space era. Sparks claims the IP moniker has been misrepresented as Interplanetary Phenomenon because the real unit to him did handle the receipt and forwarding of UFO reports. FOIA documents we will discuss have labeled the IPU as existing through quote-unquote institutional memory. Sparks believe this is because Army FOIA officers have simply misremembered around the IPU. Now, I find great fault in this reporting and very little research of substance. But now that we have addressed the IPU counterpoints, let's begin to dive in. We will primarily address the work of Robert and Ryan Wood, as well as UFO researcher Anthony Bragalia here. Please check out their respective sites, majesticdocuments.com and ufoexplorations.com. In 1980, the late Richard Hall, associate of MUFON and NICAP, filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the U.S. Army requesting information concerning Army intelligence records relating to UFOs. It is unknown and debated if Hall actually said the words Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit in his FOIA letter. Hall was advised by Colonel William Guild, Director of Army Counterintelligence, that, quote,
"Please be advised that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit of the Scientific and Technical Branch Counterintelligence Directorate was disestablished in the late 1950s and never reactivated. All records pertaining to this unit were surrendered to the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations with Operation Blue Book," end quote.
Fast forwarding to 1984, we find Steinman conducting similar FOIAs for IPU. Steinman was additionally told the IPU was disestablished and all records were transferred to USAF in the late 50s. According to Lieutenant Colonel Lance Cornine, the IPU was formed as an in-house project as an interest item for an Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. The IPU was never a unit or formally recognized mission or authority. Only through institutional memory did the Army CIC have any recollection of the IPU. Let's fast forward again to 1987 to above top secret author Timothy Good, who filed similar FOIAs. Good was given the exact same spiel as Steinman and Hall. Good was given the same spiel as Steinman and Hall. So what can we learn from these FOIAs?
A. The Army confirmed with the Army Department of Counterintelligence there was, in fact, an Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, or IPU. B. The IPU was disestablished in the late 1950s. C. The IPU records were quote-unquote surrendered to the Air Force in conjunction with Project Blue Book. D. The unit was a quote-unquote in-house project as an interest item for an unnamed Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. E. The unit lacked formal function, mission, or authority. F. It is only through quote-unquote institutional memory that the Army knows of the IPU's existence.
If IPU records were given over to Project Blue Book, why are there no records of IPU in Blue Book's many reports? With the Army's response, it is clear there is recollection of IPU, but the Army CIC is not forthcoming about information or records. Years later, CUFON, or the Computer UFO Network, received a reply from AFOSI that IPU material had been destroyed, but offered no further information. This contradicts Army reports the IPU maintained no records. Some further intriguing breadcrumbs have been reported by Anthony Bragalia. The Defense Central Index of Investigations, DCII, is a DoD automated control index that identifies and reports on investigations conducted by all DoD investigative agencies. Essentially, this served as the most complex and comprehensive acknowledged military and intelligence data center in existence. In the early 1980s, researcher John Frick became aware of DCII computer printouts made under the command of the legendary General Douglas MacArthur that related to UFO sightings and investigations. The first line of the short printout read, quote, 01 Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, end quote. I have not seen this printout reproduced, but if real, fully destroys the IPU counterargument proposed by Brad Sparks. Frick even stated some of his sources, such as the former AFOSI agent Rudolph M. Shelmar, revealed that MacArthur's IPU files were indeed transferred in 1962 to AFOSI. Perhaps IPU really did operate under MacArthur. After all, the general would discuss quote-unquote interplanetary war in 1955 and 1962 addresses. Remember here, Army FOIA stated IPU was an interest item for a Joint Chief of Staff for Intelligence, aka a G2. MacArthur's G2 was Colonel Charles A. Willoughby, who later became Chief of MacArthur's intelligence staff. Willoughby also retired as a Major General. Bragalia reported Willoughby was even equated with the legendary Philip J. Corso. However, researchers such as Timothy Good suggest the IPU did not operate directly under MacArthur, but by someone from even higher rank, MacArthur's immediate superior, General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff and later U.S. Secretary of Defense. George C. Marshall is additionally considered by the Woods as the origin for the IPU, and remember, William Steinman reported Marshall himself mobilized the IPU for the Aztec retrieval. Now let's move into discussing the IPU as it appears throughout the Majestic documents. I'm going to skip over Thomas Cantwell, the enigmatic self-proclaimed IPU member who gave several Majestic document drops to Timothy Cooper. So if you want to learn more about him, go watch my Majestic Documents investigation with Ryan Wood. If you are wondering why I am mentioning Majestic documents at all, I additionally recommend watching that same piece. Within the Majestic documents are two files alleged to be records from the IPU themselves. The Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit Field Order, dated July 1947, given to Tim Cooper by Cantwell via UPS between 1993 and 1996, as well as the IPU report dated July 1947, given to Cooper from Cantwell personally in July of 1995. Now, the quote-unquote leak dates of these IPU documents should put to bed any theory Steinman took the IPU reports at face value and constructed his Aztec case around the two documents. Outside of the two alleged internal IPU documents, there are several Majestic documents that mention the IPU. These include a 5 March 1942 memo from George Marshall to President Franklin D. Roosevelt discussing the recovery of an unidentified airplane following the infamous 1942 Battle of Los Angeles. Marshall says in this disputed document the craft was likely of interplanetary origin and suggested a special intelligence unit be created for further investigation of the phenomenon. But let's start here with the short IPU field order dated 4 July 1947 and marked top secret. The one-page memo directs a commanding officer to take a counterintelligence team to a UFO crash site and report to the G2 at Condren Field, New Mexico, which is, of course, Roswell. The commanding officer was to take a non-commissioned OIC, an aeronautical engineer, a scientist, a security officer, and a medical doctor, and to provide a report by the 28th of July. The IPU report, dated 22 July 1947, gives us far more to work with, and let's break this down a little bit as I've connected this document to various crash retrievals in the past. The intelligence assessment references recovery of multiple fallen objects from 4 to 6 July 1947. This possibly lends credence to Roswell featuring multiple UFO crash retrievals. Now, the document was prepared by the Army IPU, Scientific and Technical Branch, Counterintelligence Directorate at the behest of G2, the exact same descriptors of IPU given to 1980s researchers from FOIA. But to play devil's advocate, this document released in 1995, so if it is a hoax, the authors of the hoax could have easily copied known IPU details from researchers such as Steinman and Hall. What interests me here, though, is mention of a special radiobiological team accompanied by an SED and security detail from Sandia National Labs under orders from Colonel Hasbrouck. Armed Forces Special Weapons Project being ordered to secure the immediate area surrounding the Roswell crash site. Select scientists from the Atomic Energy Commission were amongst this team, including Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, father of the atomic bomb, an accused member of the Aztec crash by Steinman a little less than 1 decade earlier. But that's not all. The IPU also stated Dr. Detlev Bronk was in charge of biologic autopsies, just as in the Aztec case. The document states President Truman would be given a limited briefing on the incident by General Hoyt Vandenberg, but that General Eisenhower, later president, would actually be shown the recovery of the wreckage. According to Majestic Documents lore, the 1952 Eisenhower briefing document disclosed details of Roswell to Eisenhower. If he had already been briefed by IPU, why the double briefing? Well, this could be explained as the illustrious MJ-12 was established according to the Eisenhower briefing document later in September 1947, so the double briefing makes sense. The ties between Aztec, Roswell, IPU, and MAJ-12 are indeed intriguing, as the IPU report states George Marshall was the only cabinet member to date to know about crashed UFOs, but that Secretary of Defense James Forrestal would be briefed on certain aspects. In MAJ-12 lore, Truman and Forrestal engaged in September 1947 meetings to establish the Majestic 12. To learn more about Forrestal and his untimely demise, I also, again, recommend watching my MAJ-12 video. Just as in the Aztec case, recovered craft were stored at Los Alamos, and access was gatekept by one Lieutenant General Collins. Now, addressing point 9 in the document here, I have connected this to the 1974 Cayame, Mexico UFO Crash Retrieval, a fascinating and scintillating case. According to the document, Sandia personnel suffered some sort of form of non-human containment breach, possibly hazardous liquids or gas, and 3 technicians were killed. Ultimately here, the study of the IPU does not lead us to any hard conclusions. The illustrious unit exists, but its memories and records have been destroyed. I do find it utterly fascinating the sources of Steinman informed him Marshall and the IPU helmed the Aztec recovery many years before the quote-unquote leaks of these documents. And although these MAJ-12 IPU documents, released years after Steinman's research, are rightly disputed, and we cannot lean on them for any definitive statements, they paint striking parallels between the Roswell crash and Aztec crash just 8 months later. Like any good crash retrieval case before his passing, the legendary Leonard Stringfield wrote about, connected with sources, and reported on Aztec. Viewers of my channel will absolutely recognize I often celebrate Stringfield and his UFO crash retrieval status reports 1 through 7 as the best work on UFO crash retrieval operations, period. Stringfield was approached by Steinman in 1985 to write the foreword for the 1986 epic that is the ultra-rare UFO crash at Aztec, a well-kept secret. In his foreword, Stringfield wrote he was incredibly hesitant to re-engage with the case. Stringfield admitted he too had been conditioned that the case was nothing more than a hoax, schemed by Silas Newton and his dubious partner in crime, Leo Gebauer. Stringfield stated he was equally initially swindled by debunks presented by William or Bill Moore at a MUFON symposium in 1985. Moore would, around 1989, admit he was working with the U.S. intelligence community to sow disinformation into the subject of UFOs.
In any case, it was Falcon who sought me out in September of 1980. And it was Richard Doty, then with AFOSI at Kirtland Air Force Base, who soon came into play as the middleman in that process. Shortly thereafter, it became apparent to me that my supplying information to the government through Doty on the activities of Paul Benowitz, APRO, and to a lesser extent several other individuals was to be a part of this equation.
Steinman's convictions and thoroughness led to Stringfield re-engaging with the case, but what history did he have with Aztec? Let's travel back to 1974, when Aztec had long been labeled a hoax due to the sketchy reporting of J.P. Cahn. One John Spencer Carr, a retired South Florida professor of mass communications at the University of South Florida, Tampa, went public with what he professed to be new information regarding the Aztec incident in October of '74. Fortunately, Steinman obtained clippings of Carr's testimony in an October 1974 Clearwater Sun issue. Carr stated he had in his possession what he deemed to be credible information regarding Aztec, disclosed to him by 5 sources, including a senior USAF official involved in the retrieval. Carr claimed the craft and bodies of Aztec were flown to Edwards Air Force Base and ultimately taken to Wright-Patterson, 2 locations I do strongly suspect are engaged in UFO Legacy Program operations. But almost as soon as it was resurrected, Aztec was once again demolished shortly after in 1975 in an article in Official UFO by Mike McKellen titled "The UFO Crash of 1948 is a Hoax." Admittedly, Carr did seemingly report many of the Aztec details incorrectly or was confusing Aztec with another case, claiming a crash date of 12 February 48, claiming military men approached a 30-foot saucer with guns drawn and the presence of 12 non-human bodies dead from decompression. In the interest of time, we will not cover Carr's claims and McKellen's debunk as we did Newton and Cahn, but where does Stringfield fit in here? Carr and Stringfield would speak extensively after Carr went public in '74, but Carr would never reveal his sources. On 6 February 1982, Carr, fearing his own mortality, would disclose the name of his Air Force source to Stringfield. In Leonard's own words, quote,
"When Professor Carr named his source, I sat back dumbfounded. I knew his name well in research and recalled some of the source's comments on UFOs while he served as an Air Force officer. But Carr was quick to tie a string to his disclosure, stating, 'Please, Len, keep the name to yourself. Please spare me any trouble as long as I live,' end quote."
Carr and ultimately Steinman would reignite Stringfield's waning interest in Aztec, and by 1989, in UFO Crash Retrieval Status Report 5, Stringfield was writing again about Aztec and mentioning the case in the same sentences as Roswell and Kingman, 2 crashes I and many others place extreme confidence in. In 1991 Status Report 6, Stringfield would discuss and reproduce a fascinating new witness to the Aztec case. Stringfield was given permission to reproduce the report on the crash at Farmington written in 1991 by Chuck Oldham. Oldham had, in 1990, come in contact with an Aztec informant, a former alleged military officer with high security clearances. And together, the two published the witness's disclosures, as well as diagrams and images of the craft and biologics. The witness described accessing classified files discussing crashed alien craft and their occupants. Within the files, the witness stumbled upon what was an image of a perfectly intact, circular-shaped craft, lying tilted 5 to 10 degrees on one side on the ground in the desert. The craft was metallic, appearing similar to brushed aluminum. There did not appear to be a crater or ground surface disturbance caused by the impact. The report referenced to the image and craft in great detail. The witness claimed the report listed the craft was retrieved near the town of Farmington, New Mexico, just south of Aztec prior to 1950. The report stated, but the witness was unable to confirm in the photographs, that the dome part of the saucer featured porthole-type features, though they were not made of any glass. Just like the Aztec story goes, one porthole had a puncture, the diameter of a pencil. The report listed the retrieval team tried diamond drills, acetylene torches, and more on the porthole, but nothing was able to damage the craft and porthole. This reminds me closely of the 1963 RB case I covered in UFO Whistleblowers Volume 2. And just like the rest of our Aztec testimonies, an accidental fiddling of the damaged porthole led to the craft opening. One point here, though, is at odds with the rest of our Aztec discussion. The witness claimed the craft was 30-something feet in diameter. The beings inside, according to Oldham's source, were 4-foot-tall humanoids, badly charred, wearing a strong woven fabric flight suit. The report author concludes the craft likely operated on magnetic or gravitational fields to travel great distances in a minuscule amount of time. What's going on, guys? It's Gerb, and if you're still here with me now, 2+ hours in, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this investigation into Aztec. Now, if you've been with my channel for quite a while, you will probably recall all the way back over a year from now, probably, to my video on Robert SARBACHER, when I discussed Wilbert B. Smith and SARBACHER's meeting, and the two discussed behind the flying saucers, and I mentioned the Aztec case, and I said, I'm not so sure about the Aztec case. Well, since that time, there have been multiple individuals that I respect quite a bit who have talked about this case and said there's a little more than meets the eye than the J.P. Cahn debunk. And of course, with Ross Goldhart on Jesse Michaels saying Nat Kobitz directly or strongly inferred or directly told him that the Aztec case was real, I thought, well, now might be the time to dive in and give this case a fair a shake as possible. And, you know, if you're like me and arrive at similar conclusions, I do wager that this case likely happened. And I do wager it's a very complicated case. You know, similar to Roswell, we might be confusing details of multiple cases. With the UFO report, the crash at Farmington, and some other witness testimony, specifically Professor Carr, multiple individuals talk about like a 30+ foot saucer crashing and not a 99.9 diameter disc. So maybe there's some details getting confused here, but believe it or not, and I know I say this in every video, I think this project really only scratches the surface of Aztec. Remember how much time we devoted to IPU? Well, as it turns out, there's even more majestic documents, I don't know if you can see it on the camera right here, that involve Aztec. Now, why did I not include this right here? This 45-page, I think it's a DIA majestic document that, you know, Ryan and Robert Wood have not even discussed very long. Well, this is because this document drop came out in 2017 through a radio show host from a trusted source. It's I can't remember the woman's name right now. I believe it's first name Heather. But I would like to get in contact with her to find out who this trusted source is. Of course, a majestic documents drop in 2017 is decades beyond when the majority of documents drop, you know, between 1984 and 1996, let's say. So I'm quite intrigued why this specific set of documents was leaked in 2017, you know, a very critical date in UFO lore. But the reason I didn't speak about this is because this document says some pretty bizarre things, pretty outlandish things, specifically about Nikola Tesla. That kind of, it reads almost like a novel. You know, it's a really good read, which is kind of why I take apprehension here, but also because this majestic document, again, I'll put it right up here and I'll put the link in the video description, pretty much tells the Aztec case verbatim in the same style of story as Steinman. So it talks about IPU, it talks about all the recovery methods Steinman talks about. So one of my preliminary theories here is that this document drop, of course, as soon as a ton of interest starts back up in UFOs around 2017, you know, quite possibly this document drop was meant to muddy the waters surrounding the Aztec case. And maybe by recovering Steinman's account of the case, that it just means, hey, Steinman could have ripped this off a random majestic document that existed way back in the day. So that's why I didn't include this. And speaking of Steinman and majestic documents, you know, the IPU report and field order dropped in 1995 and 1996, I believe, are the dates off the top of my head. Now, one of the things I grappled with back and forth is, did Steinman have a previous experience with these documents, and he constructed his Aztec case based upon the IPU report specifically? Because as we know, General George Marshall, others, the IPU, Sandia, Los Alamos are mentioned within that document. But perhaps there could be credence here, because the same thing with Dr. Eric Walker, Steinman did keep his name secret for quite a few years in hopes that Walker would speak out. Perhaps there's a world in which that majestic document was released to some researchers back in the 80s, the IPU reports, and it was kept a little secret until Thomas Cantwell gave the documents to Timothy Cooper back in 1996, I believe the IPU report was. But I digress. There's nothing to substantiate that theory, but it is interesting nonetheless. And again, this ultra top secret majestic report from the DIA comes out in 2017, telling the Steinman account of Aztec verbatim. So I'm not quite sure what to do with this document. Perhaps I'll make a Majestic Documents follow-up part 2 where we can analyze some of the more controversial documents. Project Aquarius, maybe this document and some others. So maybe we'll do that in the future, but I'd like to know what you guys think about this video. I mean, I'll tell you what right now. I don't think I've ever said the word doodlebug so much in my life. It was pretty tough recording the script, trying to talk about magnetic anomaly detection devices and Carl Hyland and RSI. Geospatial Services Inc., GSI, my apologies, and try and say doodlebug with a straight face. But when I found Texas Instrument in 1980, their 30-year history, saying, hey, we pay respects to our doodlebuggers back in the day, I got a little bit more relaxed about saying such things. So I know in this video there was a lot of information discussed, and if you're going to purchase one book or pursue one lead after this, I can't recommend enough buying the Ramsey's book that I have right here. The book is fantastic. It is exactly how I like to do research. All sources are always cited. There's a massive reference tab. There's numerous pictures. I mean, there's stuff I didn't even speak about in this video, such as the Ramseys hiring, various professionals who weren't even into UFOs to reconstruct how the Hart Canyon roads could have been used to transport the huge disc to Los Alamos. So a ton more groundwork in that book. And, I barely even scratched the surface with it. And of course, we got the big boy here. This certainly put a dent in my pocket. It's a pretty expensive book, but if I was going to do a video on Aztec, I needed the book. There's so much awesome artwork and some truly astonishing things written by Steinman here. I expressed it multiple times in the video, but I do have frustration. Steinman so cavalierly discusses as fact, hey, the IPU retrieved the disc, General George Marshall got the call, Highland, Oppenheimer, Vannevar Bush, they were all there at the site. Especially Scherer and Dr. Detlef Bronk, but doesn't give any, references to his sources or even corroborating evidence. So although he has a ton of exhibits throughout the book, and these include scanned documents, J.P. Cahn's debunk, Mike McKellen's debunk, Robert Carr's testimony, he does lack there. So that is my biggest critique of the book. But I do think it's excellent, especially the work on Dr. Eric Henry Wang. That is a thread that continues to persist in my research today. Who was Wang? Why can I find nothing about him besides the odd civil engineering tribune to him as he's passed, and solely his mention in Operation Upshot Knothole, which of course Arthur Stancil claimed he worked under Dr. Eric Henry Wang for the Kingman incident, and that Dr. Wang spearheaded the reverse engineering and retrieval efforts for that. So the parallels between Aztec, Roswell, and Kingman, I know I said in the video, are endless. These cases seem to be handled and executed, the recoveries, in an extremely similar manner. You can kind of tell with the Aztec case, what's interesting to me is different methods and approaches after the folly that was Roswell. And that included when that knucklehead Silas Newton started talking about the event. Did Carl Hyland discuss to Leo Gebauer and Silas Newton? Was he the informant of Aztec? Maybe. I know that Steinman really presses this, and I really applaud his theory there. But if we could just have tangible evidence that under Hyland's company, Leo Gebauer worked there, or Gebauer and Hyland worked together in Antarctica in the 30s, like Steinman said, the thesis would be so much stronger. I mean, even if we had evidence that Gebauer worked for Dr. Paul Scherer in the kind of cryogenic containment units meant to freeze the biologics, we'd have so much more to chew on there. And let me know what you think about the court case as well. I've never covered court proceedings before, but I found it pretty interesting, especially Dr. James Meredith of Colorado School of Mines, who was indeed in the same department as Hyland, testifying that the doodlebug could not find oil, let alone a submarine. And he analyzed war surplus store parts that was, quote unquote, very similar to the Doodlebug purchased for $4.45. We also proved, whether it's the work of GSI, even patents from Vannevar Bush and other patents, that magnetic anomaly detection devices or reflective seismograph technology, both of these, for the sole purpose of finding oil, was extensively utilized pre-World War II. And then in World War II, many of the corporations or many of the brightest minds that are working on reflective seismology or MADS to detect oil are brought in by Vannevar Bush to the OSRD to make submarine detecting equipment. So that, as relayed by Scully in the 50s for these secret war projects, that is some very tangible stuff to work with. What else do we have that's tangible to work with? We have the sting operation in 50 from CID and FBI. That is interesting. We have discussions of J. Edgar Hoover messaging about Silas Newton. Now, I don't blame individuals for, at the beginning of this video, if they made it all through the end, first saying, Gerb, why are you covering Aztec? It was proven a hoax. I was victim of this as well, as I said at the beginning of this rant. So was Leonard Stringfield. And I love that in the foreword to William Steinman's book. Leonard Stringfield said, I was taken by the work of J.P. Cahn and Bill Moore. Bill Moore, of course, we showed him on the MUFON Symposium in '89 saying he was working with intelligence agencies. Perhaps Bill Moore, there's some theories floating around that Bill Moore and Richard Doty made some majestic documents. Maybe they had a hand in this puppy right here. But let's discuss Aztec more. I'll say this again, this is just to kickstart research into this case, and I want to know what everybody thinks. And before we log off for the day, a couple of action items. I was just out of town to go on a show, and there I got to meet an individual who's making a documentary. I got a signed poster here from Mr. Luigi, I think it's Venditilli, right? For Project Gravatar. I had been interested in this case, in this documentary, since I met Chris Ramsey back at the November hearings. And he was telling me all about, hey, I've been talking to Luigi, I've been paying attention to Gravatar, and there's going to be a lot they're talking about Bob Lazar in this new documentary. If you know anything about me, you'll know I've been infatuated with the story of Bob since I was a wee youngster. But I tend not to talk about Bob because I am so biased towards him, and I will always acknowledge that. More than anything, I want to believe Bob Lazar. So I tend to not be able to critically analyze pro or con statements with Bob. So I tend to keep him out. But I got to see some stuff with Project Gravatar. And guys, please be excited. This is awesome. This is exactly what I wanted from the Jeremy Corbell documentary. Luigi said to me, maybe I'm putting too much information in. And guys, if you're watching this channel and made it here, we like too much information. So Project Gravatar is very strict on reducing drama, following leads, especially names, full names. You might have heard some names associated with Bob's case, but we're talking full names and identified individuals. And the photorealistic recreated S4 is something to behold. That is wicked, wicked, wicked cool. So yeah, if you see my wall, you already see the sports model drawn by Bob and the propulsion system by Bob. Now I'm going to have the signed Project Gravatar poster by Bob. So it's turned into a bit of a Volkanovsky and Bob shrine. If anybody has some awesome artwork they would like to send in, please let me know. And I'll give you kind of like a PO box or a shipping address, because I would love to hang up some diagrams, some really cool art on the wall. So please get in contact with me, uapgerb@gmail.com or uapgerb@protonmail.com. And let's get that started, because I want to feature some more artwork. Channel-wise, I got some huge stuff coming up for the channel that I'm pretty excited about. A lot of huge projects like this. It seems like every project I make these days, I can't really get it under an hour and 45 minutes. So we'll just keep rolling with that. I got some good ideas in the tank and some good stuff coming up outside of the channel too, and stuff around the channel. So please keep up with that. Remember, guys, I do have a Patreon. I'd love if you went and subscribed and gave me money every month. I don't gatekeep content, so there's no restricted content on there, or I'll probably start up YouTube memberships as well. So feel free to give me money every month there. I don't gatekeep content, so only give what you think the channel is worth. But If you're not going to do that, totally fine. Please at least like and subscribe the video. Give me a comment what you think. I am just thrilled that everybody is here watching, and I'm incredibly blessed to have people watching the videos, making it all the way through. So thank you so much. And again, let me know what you thought about the Aztec case. This is just the beginning of me talking about it. So with that being said, remember to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I will see everybody on the next show. Thank you so much. Bye.